Hey guys, tonight we are heading back to the American Wild West, but we're not going to be riding alongside legendary gunslingers or digging for chests of gold. No, we're exploring something far more fundamental. We're going to talk about dinner. Specifically, we're going to dismantle that cozy campfire fantasy of sizzling steaks and hearty stews that you see in the movies. The reality, I'm afraid, was a lot more crunchy, and not in a good way. Let's be honest, based on the food alone, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Right now, you're standing on a crowded street somewhere in the east. Maybe it's Boston or New York, or a small, suffocating town in Ohio. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp wood, and the press of too many people into small space. Life is a series of straight lines and sharp corners, the grid of the city streets, the rigid hierarchy of your job, the unwritten rules of society that keep you in your place. But lately, your mind has been drifting westward. You close your eyes and you can almost see it. A sky so vast and blue, it feels like you could fall right into it. The land doesn't just stretch out. It sprawls, indifferent and magnificent, rolling on in waves of green and gold, until it meets the horizon. This isn't just a place. It's a promise. It's the whisper of a word that's been floating on the air for years now. Opportunity. It's the grand idea of manifest destiny, not as a political slogan, but as a feeling deep in your gut, a sense that your future, your real life, is waiting for you out there, somewhere past the Mississippi River. Your daydreams are fueled by more than just imagination. You have a pamphlet, folded and worn from being read so many times. It was printed on cheap paper, but the words on it are pure gold. It describes the West as a new Eden, a land of milk and honey. One passage you've practically memorized claims the soil is so fertile, you need only to tickle it with a hoe, and it will laugh with a harvest. You've read tales from so-called experts who swear that the rain will follow the plow, that the simple act of farming will change the climate itself, turning arid plains into lush farmland. It all sounds so simple, so perfect, and the food you imagine. You picture yourself at the end of a long day's travel, the wagon circled under a canopy of stars brighter than you've ever seen. A crackling campfire pushes back the dark, and hanging over it is a spit, turning slowly. On that spit is a succulent piece of wild game, maybe a deer, or a plump prairie chicken, its skin crisp and dripping juices that sizzle in the flames. You can almost smell the wood smoke and roasting meat. You imagine a bubbling pot of stew, thick with wild onions and tender chunks of buffalo. You think of biscuits, baked golden brown, in a cast iron Dutch oven, ready to sop up every last drop of gravy. This is the fuel of pioneers, the hearty fare of self-sufficient heroes. This is the life you're choosing. Historians still debate the true driving force behind this massive migration. Was it purely the cold, hard logic of economics, the lure of real and offered by the Homestead Act, a chance to escape wage slavery in the industrial East? Or was there something more primal, a deep-seated cultural yearning to escape the old world's constraints and forge a new, pure identity in the crucible of the frontier? For you, it's a mix of both. You are tired of the factory whistle and the landlord's knock. You are enchanted by the idea of being your own master, of building something from nothing with your own two hands. So the decision is made. You sell off what little you own, a piece of furniture here, some tools there. You say your goodbyes, which are a mix of tearful warnings from the cautious and envious handshakes from the dreamers. There's a knot of fear in your stomach, but it's overshadowed by a powerful, thrilling wave of optimism. You are not just moving your home. You are stepping into the pages of history. You are becoming one of the trailblazers, the pioneers, the architects of a new nation. You're holding on to that perfect, romantic image of the West as you start to plan what you'll need for the journey. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar surely, with a wagon full of good provisions and all, and teeming with wild game. You eat like a tin. You have absolutely no idea what's coming. The dream is one thing. The reality of cramming that dream into a wooden box on wheels is another. Your first stop is the outfitting post, a bustling, chaotic hub on the edge of the wilderness. This is where your journey truly begins, not with a majestic vista, but with a series of hard, practical decisions. The air hums with a nervous energy, a mix of excitement and barely concealed panic. It smells of new canvas, leather, actual grease, and the sharp, earthy scent of livestock. You stand before your vessel, the prairie schooner. It's not as grand as its name suggests. It's a farm wagon, maybe 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a simple arched canvas cover to keep out the sun and rain. It looks sturdy, but also achingly small. This box, you realize, has to hold everything you need to cross a continent and start a new life. Everything. The wagon salesman, a man with a twinkle in his eye and a knack for glossing over the negatives, sells you on its resilient hickory, wooden dependable iron-rimmed wheels. He doesn't mention that in the dry plains air, that wood will shrink, and those iron rims will slide right off, unless you constantly soak the wheels in any river you're lucky enough to find. This little-known fact leads many pioneers to pack basic cooperage tools, not something you'd think of when dreaming of open skies. Now for the food. You clutch a popular immigrant's guide, its pages filled with authoritative-sounding lists. These guides were the Bibles of the trail, and they all agreed on the core essentials. First and foremost, flour, not just a bag or two. The guide recommends at least 150 to 200 pounds per adult. You heft one of the heavy canvas sacks, the fine powder shifting within. This, you are told, will be the foundation of almost every meal. It's for biscuits, for pancakes, for gravy, for patching up a stew. It is the bulky, bland, life-sustaining heart of your provisions. Next is the meat. You picture sides of beef or whole hogs, but the reality is bacon, cured, salted, and packed in barrels of bran to absorb the excess grease. Bacon was the protein of choice. It was prized not for its flavor, but for its longevity and high-fat content. The guide suggests 75 pounds per adult. This isn't the crisp, lean bacon you might know. This is thick, fatty side meat, heavily salted to the point of being almost inedible without a long soak. Its purpose is less about being a pleasant meal and more about being a calorie bomb to fuel hard labor. Then come the essentials for morale, coffee and sugar. You buy your coffee beans green, because roasted beans go stale too quickly. You'll have to roast them yourself each morning over the campfire, a small ritual that will become one of the few comforts on the trail. The guide recommends 20 to 25 pounds of coffee and double that in sugar. You also stock up on the supporting cast, a massive bag of beans, some dried rice, and a few sacks of dried apples and peaches, their shriveled forms promising a distant memory of sweetness. A small keg of vinegar is essential, not just for flavor, but for its supposed medicinal properties. A box of salt, a tin of baking soda. Here is where the first mistakes are made, and it's a subject historians still argue about. Was the bigger error in judgment packing too many sentimental, heavy items, or was it a fundamental failure to grasp the sheer quantity of basic staples required? One school of thought focuses on the heartbreaking sight of trails littered with abandoned heirlooms, pianos, mahogany dressers, heavy iron stoves, even entire libraries of books, cast aside when the oxen could pull no more. These were failures of the heart, an inability to let go of the old life. But other historians argue the more fatal mistake was a failure of imagination. Pioneers couldn't truly conceive of 5 straight months without a grocery store. They depack 150 pounds of flour, run out halfway through, and find themselves in a desperate situation because they simply couldn't envision a world where you couldn't just buy more. You, trying to be wise, stick mostly to the list, but you make a few exceptions. A small, heavy cast iron pot from your mother's kitchen. A single, cherished porcelain teacup, carefully wrapped in cloth. A small crate of precious preserves, jars of strawberry jam and pickled vegetables. A taste of home, They seem so small, so reasonable. You carefully arrange everything in the wagon, a complex game of Tetris with sacks of flour, barrels of bacon, and wooden crates. The heaviest items go in the bottom, centered over the axles. You try to arrange it so you can get to the daily supplies: the coffee pot, a skillet, a small sack of flour without having to unpack the entire wagon. Finally, it's done. The wagon is packed to the brim. The canvas pulled taut over the hoops. It groans under the weight. You look at your work with a sense of pride and accomplishment. You feel prepared. You feel self-sufficient. You are ready to conquer the wilderness. As you stand there, admiring your handiwork, you fail to notice the tiny weevil eggs already dormant in the flour. You are unaware of the microscopic mold spores beginning to bloom on the edge of the bacon slab, deep within its salty barrel. And you have no idea that those beautiful glass jars of jam, with their imperfectly sealed lids, are a ticking time bomb of potential spoilage and sickness. The food you've so carefully chosen is about to become your greatest adversary. The first few weeks on the trail are a strange honeymoon period. You're moving, finally, carted along, snaking caravan of white-topped wagons that looks like a river of canvas flowing west. The mood is optimistic, almost festive. In the evenings, someone pulls out a fiddle, and the sound of music and laughter drifts between the campfires. You're making new friends, sharing stories with people from all walks of life, all united by this one grand, slightly insane adventure. The food, in these early days, is still good. It's a direct reflection of the life you just left behind. You're still close enough to civilization to buy fresh eggs and milk from farms you pass along the way. The bread you eat is made from the fresh, clean flour at the top of the sack. The bacon, when you slice into the barrel, is still firm and has a smoky, salty aroma that feels comforting and familiar. One evening, you decide to celebrate a small milestone: crossing the Missouri River, the Great Muddy, which feels like a true point of no return. You decide to open one of your precious jars of home-canned vegetables. It's a jar of pickled green beans, lovingly prepared by your sister. As you pry open the lid, there's a satisfying pulp. The beans look perfect, suspended in their clear brine with a sprig of dill. You share them with your new mess, the small group of wagons you travel and camp with. The crisp, vinegary snap of the beans is an explosion of flavor in a diet that is quickly becoming dominated by salt and grease. It tastes like home. It tastes like victory. But the honeymoon can't last. The West is not a gentle host. Your first reel: try a listen to dramatic river crossing or standoff with bandits. It's the weather. One afternoon, the impossibly blue sky turns a sickly shade of greenish gray. The air becomes heavy and still. The experienced trail hands start shouting orders, a frantic energy gripping the wagon tray. Circle the wagons. Tie down the canvas. Secure the animals. You scramble to obey, your heart pounding with a nameless dread. Then the storm hits. It's not just rain. It's a horizontal assault of wind and water, a fury you've never experienced before. The wind shrieks like a living thing, tearing at the canvas cover of your wagon, threatening to rip it to shreds. Rain doesn't fall. It drives, finding every tiny gap in your defenses. You huddle inside your small wooden box, listening to the world dissolve into a roaring chaos. The wagon rocks violently, and you can hear the terrified bellows of the oxen outside. It lasts for what feels like an eternity, and then, as quickly as it began, it stops. A profound, dripping silence descends, broken only by the whimpers of a frightened child in a nearby wagon. You cautiously push back the flap of your canvas and peer outside. The world is a sea of mud. The campfire is a soggy, blackened pit. Everything is salt. A quick damage assessment reveals the true cost of the storm. A corner of your canvas cover, the one you swore you tied down securely, came loose. A cascade of water poured directly onto your provisions. The top 2 sacks of flour are now a solid, gluey paste. A small bag of sugar has dissolved into a sticky, brown syrup that is now coating a box of your clothes. Your precious stock of dried apples, which you'd foolishly left in a cloth sack instead of a sealed tin, is a swollen, mushy and rapidly fermenting mess. This is your first lesson in the unforgiving nature of the trail, and it leads to a weird, little-known piece of pioneer ingenuity. What do you do with flour that's gotten wet? You can't bake with it. You can't throw it away. Every ounce is precious. The trail cook shows you what to do. You scrape the gummy paste out of the sack and mix it with a bit of salt. Then you fry it in bacon grease. The result is a tough, chewy, slightly sour pancake known as a flour grout. It's not pleasant, but it's calories. You eat it, forcing yourself to chew the dense, rubbery mouthfuls. This is survival. Historians often debate the psychological impact of these early losses. Some argue that these moments were crucial for seasoning the pioneers, stripping away their naivety and forcing them to adopt a hardened mindset necessary for survival. Others suggest that for many, this was the beginning of a deep-seated despair, the first crack in the foundation of their dream. They argue that the constant, grinding battle against spoilage and waste took a heavier toll on morale than any single dramatic event. As you choke down your flour grout pancake, you look at the other families. You see the same grim expressions. The festive atmosphere of the first weeks is gone, washed away by the storm. You check on your last few jars of preserves. One of them, a jar of strawberry jam, has had its seal broken by the jostling of the storm. A thin layer of white mold is already blooming on the surface. You know you should throw it out, but you can't bring yourself to do it. Not yet. You scrape off the mold, telling yourself it's fine. It's a small compromise, a tiny act of self-deception in the face of a mounting reality. The food is starting to turn, and your journey has only just begun. The mud from the storm eventually dries, taking the wagon wheels and your boots in a thick, stubborn crust. The sun returns, beating down with an intensity that feels personal. The landscape begins to change. The gentle, rolling green hills of the prairie start to flatten out, the trees becoming scarcer until they disappear altogether, replaced by an endless expanse of tough, short grass under a sky that feels unnervingly vast. And with this change in scenery comes a new, all-consuming obsession. Water. Back east, water was something you took for granted. It flowed from pumps. It filled wells. It fell from the sky. Out here, it is everything. It is life, currency, and a capricious god that bestows its favor randomly. The wagon rain now plans its entire day, its entire existence, around the next known water source. The entries in your guidebook, which once seemed so dry and factual, are now holy scripture. Ash hollow, good water and wood, or Platte River, water shallow and warm, but plentiful. Your daily water ration is strictly enforced. A certain amount for the people, a much larger, more critical amount for the oxen. The animals always drink first. You learn to measure your own thirst not in gulps, but in sips. You start your day with a cup of coffee, and that might be the last clean, hot liquid you have until evening. The water in the barrel on the side of the wagon gets warm and stale as the day wears on, tasting of wooden desperation. One afternoon, you arrive at a promised creek, only to find it bone dry. Its bed a cracked mosaic of sun-baked mud. A collective groan of despair ripples through the wagon rain. The trail boss makes a grim announcement. The next water is 15 miles away. You'll have to push on, into the dusk and possibly into the night. That evening, there is no leisurely campfire. There is no music. There is only the plodding of exhausted animals, the creak of the wagons, and the dry rasp of your own breathing. When you finally stumble toward the next river, the mighty Platte, you want to weep with relief. But the relief is short-lived. The Platte River is famously described as a mile wide and an inch deep. It's vast, but the water is a murky, silk-filled soup. It's warm, brown, and sluggish. You can see things floating in it, but it's wet. This is where you learn about settling. You fill your bucket with the cloudy river water. The trail cook, a grizzled man who has seen it all, shows you a trick. He tosses a handful of cornmeal into the bucket. You watch, fascinated, as the cornmeal slowly binds to the suspended silt and clay particles, dragging them to the bottom. It's a primitive form of flocculation. After about an hour, the top layer of water is passably clear. It still tastes gritty, like liquid dust. but you can drink it without chewing. Some historians argue that this constant ingestion of silt and grit contributed significantly to the dental problems that plagued pioneers, wearing down their teeth over time. It's a strange, niche debate. Was it the hardtack or the water that was worse for your teeth? The water isn't just dirty. It's dangerous. The Platte is the main artery of the migration, and thousands of people and animals are using it as their highway, laundry, and toilet. The threat of trail fever, a catch-all term for diseases like cholera and typhoid, is ever present. You learn to take your water from upstream of the main camp, and to be very, very careful about where you relieve yourself. A single sick person contaminating a water source could devastate an entire wagon train. This desperation for water led to some truly bizarre and little-known practices. One of the strangest was the use of water witches or dowsers. These were individuals who claimed they could find underground water using a forked stick, usually from a willow or hazel tree. They'd hold the two forks of the Y-shaped branch, with the stem pointing forward, and walk slowly over the dry ground. When the tip of the stick supposedly dipped or twitched, that was the spot to dig. It's a practice that science has thoroughly debunked as pseudoscience. Yet on the plains, in the grip of a desperate thirst, people were willing to believe in anything. You watch a man in a neighboring wagon drain to it, his face a mask of concentration, and for a moment, you let yourself hope Chia's right. The debate over whether dowsers had some intuitive, unexplainable skill, or were simply adept at reading subtle geological clues, or just plain lucky, continues in folklore circles to this day. As you sit by the fire, sipping your gritty, settled water, you think about the pamphlet that called this the land of milk and honey. You haven't seen any milk since the last farmstead, and the only honey is the memory of it. You look out at the vast, arid landscape, and you realize the romantic promises were eaten by people who never had to worry about their next trip. Out here, you learn the truth. The real gold of the West isn't yellow and shiny. It's clear and cool, and it fits in a cup. And it's rarer than you could ever have imagined. You've been on the trail for over a month now, and the rhythm of life has settled into a grinding routine. The sun dictates your schedule. You rise before dawn. The air is still cool and crisp, and the first thing you hear is the sound of someone grinding coffee beans. The first thing you smell is wood smoke. This is the domain of the Chuckwagon cook. In the movies, the Chuckwagon cook is often a jolly, cantankerous, pop-eyed character actor, a source of comic relief and sage advice. The reality standing before you is a bit different. Your cook is a man named Cookie. They're all called Cookie. Regardless of their actual name, and he is arguably the most important and most feared person on the trail. He is gaunt, weary, and perpetually covered in a fine layer of dust and flour. His mood is as unpredictable as the weather. He is the master of this rolling kitchen, and his word is law. The Chuckwagon itself is a marvel of efficiency, a testament to practical design. It's a standard, sturdy wagon, but its entire back end has been retrofitted with a large box. The Chuck box. This box is a complex piece of cabinetry, filled with a honeycomb of small drawers and shelves. Each one has a specific purpose. There's a drawer for tin plates and cups, another for cutlery. There are slots for spices if you're lucky, and secure bins for flour and coffee. The hinged lid of the Chuck box folds down to create a work table. Under the wagon, a possum belly cowhide sling is stretched between the axles, carrying firewood or cow chips. A water barrel is strapped to the side. This is Cookie's kingdom. You watch him work in the Perdon gloom. He moves with a practiced, economical grace. He doesn't waste a single motion. First, he builds the fire. Wood is increasingly scarce, so he often relies on prairie coal dried buffalo dung. It burns surprisingly hot and clean, with a strangely neutral, earthy smell. You've gotten used to it. You've even collected it yourself. A task that would have horrified you 2 months ago. Once the fire is roaring, the huge coffee pot goes on. Then, the Dutch oven, a heavy, lidded cast iron pot that is the single most essential piece of cooking equipment out here. Cookie starts the day's biscuits, his hands moving quickly, mixing flour, salt, baking soda, and a lump of lard in a large bowl. He adds water, kneads the dough briefly, and then shapes it into small, rough circles. He places them in the greased Dutch oven, puts the heavy lid on, and then shovels hot coals from the fire both underneath the pot and on top of the lid, creating a surprisingly even, enveloping heat. This is where you encounter a strange, almost culinary, bit of folklore. Seasoned trail cooks swore by a secret ingredient for their biscuits: sour scrapings. When they cleaned their dough bowl, they wouldn't wash it thoroughly. They'd leave a thin layer of dough to dry and ferment slightly. The next morning, they'd scrape this into the new batch. This, they claimed, was a primitive sourdough starter, giving the biscuits a better rise and a more complex, tangy flavor. Historians who study foodways are divided on whether this was a genuine produce, or a technique, or simply a consequence of poor hygiene that cooks later romanticized. Either way, it was a common practice. The rest of the breakfast is simple. A slab of bacon is sliced and fried in a massive skillet. The grease is carefully saved. Nothing is ever wasted. The bacon itself is a gamble. Sometimes it's fine, just incredibly salty. Other times, you bite into a piece and get a rancid, sour taste that makes you want to spit it out. But you don't. You swallow it. It's protein. The call for check rings out, and you line up, tin plate in hand. You get a couple of biscuits, a few strips of bacon, and a ladle of gravy, which is just bacon grease mixed with flour and water or coffee, cooked until it's a thick, brown sludge, and, of course, a cup of coffee. You eat quickly, standing up or perched on a wagon tongue. There's no time for leisurely meals. As soon as you're done, the camp is being dismantled. The oxen yoke and the wagons start rolling. The Chuckwagon cook's job doesn't end there. He drives his wagon, often at the head of the train, and is the first to pull into the designated campsite in the evening. While you are still tending to your tired animals, he has already started the fire and is beginning the evening meal. Dinner is often a variation on lunch, which was a variation on breakfast. The star of the show, more often than not, is beans. Endless, eternal beans. He puts them on to soak in the morning, and they bubble away over the fire all evening. You learn to respect Cookie. You learn not to get in his way. You learn to never, ever complain about the food, at least not where he can hear you. His authority was absolute. He could withhold rations from a troublemaker. And on the trail, that was a sentence of misery. You came to the West dreaming of being your own master, but you've quickly learned that for the next several months, your happiness, your morale, and your very survival are in the hands of a cranky, overworked man in his mobile kitchen. The sun beats down, the wagon wheels creak, the oxen plod, and for dinner, there are beans. Again, at first, the pot of bubbling beans at the end of a long, dusty day was a welcome sight. They were hot, they were filling, and after a diet increasingly dominated by dry biscuits and salty bacon, their soft texture was a relief. But now, weeks later, the sight of that same pot inspires a quiet, deep-seated sense of resignation. The beans are almost always the same. Pinto beans, the workhorse of the Chuckwagon. They are cheap, they are durable, and they swell up to feed a crowd. Every evening, Cookie produces a variation on a theme. Sometimes, they are just plain, boiled in water with a bit of salt. If you're real lucky, he might throw in a chunk of bacon for flavor, the fat rendering out to create a richer broth. If he's in a particularly good mood, or if a wild onion was found, he might add there. On a truly special occasion, there might be a hint of chili powder, a precious commodity hoarded in one of the Chuckwagon's little drawers. You've heard them called prairie strawberries and Mexican strawberries, a classic bit of cowboy humor that was funny the first time you heard it. Now, it just feels like a sad joke. Use it with your tin plate, the steam from the mound of beans rising to meet your face. You eat them dutifully. They are calories. They are sustenance. They are fuel to get you through another day of walking, another day of dust. The monotony is soul-crushing. It's a strange kind of hunger, being full but completely unsatisfied. Your body is getting what it needs to function, but your mind, your palate, craves variety. It craves a different texture, a different flavor, You find yourself daydreaming about food you once took for granted. A crisp apple, a soft piece of cheese, a simple potato. These daydreams are so vivid they are almost painful. One of the most persistent myths of the cowboy diet is the image of a pot of beans bubbling over an open fire for hours and hours. While partly true, this brings up a little-known culinary challenge of the plains: the effect of altitude. As the wagon train slowly climbs in elevation, the boiling point of water drops. This means that at several thousand feet above sea level, water boils at a temperature well below the 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 Celsius, needed to properly soften dried beans. A cook could boil a pot of beans all day, and they would still be crunchy and hard to digest. This led to the widespread use of the Dutch oven, as its heavy, tight-fitting lid could trap steam and increase the pressure, effectively creating a primitive pressure cooker. Without this technology, a pot of beans could be a truly miserable to throttling experience. Historians of technology and food science sometimes point to this as a fascinating example of how a simple piece of equipment was scientifically crucial to making the frontier diet even remotely palatable. The other issue with the beans, of course, is their well-known side effect. In a crowded camp, with people sleeping in close quarters in or under their wagons, the nightly chorus of prairie trombones becomes just another part of the soundscape. Along with the crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, it's a source of endless jokes, but also a source of genuine discomfort. The debate among historians here is subtle but interesting. Was the heavy reliance on beans purely a matter of economics and durability, or was it also a matter of culinary ignorance? Some argue that cooks of the era, even skilled ones, had a limited repertoire and simply didn't know how to prepare the few ingredients they had in more varied ways. They stuck to what they knew, boiling and frying. Others contend this is an unfair judgment. They argue that given the severe constraints, limited water for cleaning, no fresh ingredients, constant pressure to cook quickly for a large group, the monotonous bean and bacon diet was the only logical outcome. The Chuckwagon cook wasn't failing creatively, he was succeeding logistically. One evening, desperate for a change, you try an experiment. You take your ration of beans and mash them with the back of your fork. You then take one of your dry, hard biscuits and crumble it into the bean paste. You mix it all together into a thick, unappetizing patty. You manage to get a little space on the communal skillet after the bacon is done, and you fry your bean and biscuit cake in the leftover grease. The result is interesting. It's hot, crispy on the outside, and mushy on the inside. It doesn't taste like much, other than salted bean and burnt flour, but the texture is different. It's a change. A few of the others and your mess watch you. Intrigued, the next night, two of them try it as well. It becomes your own little culinary rebellion, a tiny assertion of individuality in the face of overwhelming, soul-crushing sameness. You call them desperation cakes. They're not good, but they are yours, and as you chew your gritty, greasy creation, you realize you've learned it. Another hard lesson of the West. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding small ways to stay sane. If beans are the bland, dependable rhythm section of your diet, the biscuits are the unpredictable lead instrument. They can be a source of comfort, or they can be an instrument of torment. It all depends on cookie's mood, the quality of the flour, and the fickle nature of the campfire. The official name for them is sourdough biscuits, but that name implies a level of artistry and consistency that is rarely, if ever, achieved on the trail. The ideal is a thing of beauty, a biscuit that is light, fluffy on the inside, with a golden brown, slightly chewy crust. It should have a subtle, tangy flavor from the sourdough starter, a perfect vehicle for sopping up bacon grease, or for being slathered with molasses on a good day. You've had a biscuit like that, maybe once or twice. In the very early days of the journey, it was a revelation. It made you believe that life on the trail could have its simple pleasures. The reality, most days, is a sinker. A sinker is a biscuit that has failed. It's a dense, doughy, and often undercooked puck of flour and water. Biting into one is a depressing experience. Your teeth meet a surprising amount of resistance, and the inside is a gummy, flavorless paste that sticks to the roof of your mouth. They sit in your stomach like a stone, a heavy reminder of culinary disappointment. The culprit is usually the starter. A true sourdough starter is a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, a complex ecosystem that needs to be fed and cared for like a pet. Cookie starter is a bucket of primordial goo that he keeps in the chuck box. It's fed with flour and water, and sometimes potato water if a rare potato makes an appearance. But the trail is a harsh environment for a delicate yeast culture. The constant jostling, the extreme temperature swings from scorching day to freezing night, and the questionable water quality all take their toll. Sometimes the starter becomes sluggish and weak, unable to produce the gas needed to leaven the dough. Other times, the wrong kind of bacteria takes over, making it so sour it's almost acidic, producing biscuits that taste like they've been soaked in vinegar. One morning, you watch Cookie prepare the biscuits and you notice something is wrong. The dough looks slack and lifeless. He kneads it with a grim expression, his usual efficiency replaced with a sense of weary obligation. When the biscuits come out of the Dutch oven, they are pale and flat. They are sinkers, a collective. Unspoken sigh seems to pass through the camp as everyone receives their ration. You take yours and try to make the best of it, breaking it into your coffee to soften it. It turns your coffee into a lukewarm, lumpy gruel. This leads to one of the trail's many desperate food hacks. When the biscuits are particularly bad, you don't eat them fresh. You let them dry out completely until they are rock hard. Then, you use a rock or the butt of a knife to smash them into crumbs. You save these crumbs in a little cloth bag. You call it biscuit dust. This dust can be used to thicken a watery gravy or a thin stew, adding a bit of substance. It's not about flavor. It's about not wasting a single calorie. This practice of turning failed bread into a thickening agent is ancient, but on the trail, it feels like a new, sad discovery. There's a persistent historical debate about the true nature of sourdough in the Old West. Was the term used accurately, referring to a genuine yeast leavening process, or was sourdough just a catch-all nickname for any biscuit made on the trail, most of which were likely just chemical-leavened sail radish biscuits using baking soda? Sail radish, the romantic image is of the grizzled prospector carefully nurturing his pot of starter. But many food historians argue that the much more common reality was a quick, unreliable biscuit made with baking soda, which was easier to transport and required no maintenance. The sourdough name might have been more myth than reality, a story told to add a bit of romance to a very mundane food. Your own attempts at baking are no better. One day, your mess decides to pull some of your precious private flour rations to make your own bread in the evening. Hoping to do better than Cookie, you mix the dough carefully, letting it rise near the fire. But you are not a master of campfire cooking. You misjudge the heat. You put too many coals on the bottom of the Dutch oven and not enough on top. The result is a culinary disaster. The bottom of the loaf is a blackened, carbonized brick. The top is pale and doughy. The inside is a smoky, uncooked swamp. It's a perfect illustration of failure. You have to chisel the burnt part off with a knife, and what remains is barely edible. You've wasted flour, you've wasted time, and you've wasted hope. You look at the sad, misshapen loaf, and it feels like a metaphor for the whole journey. You started with such high hopes, such a perfect image in your mind, but the reality, forged in the harsh fire of the West, is often burnt, underdone, and deeply disappointing. You eat your piece of the failed bread anyway. Of course you do. You scrape off the worst of the charcoal, and you chew the smoky, doughy center, and you try to convince yourself that it's better than nothing. In this landscape of blandness, there is one ingredient that reigns supreme, one flavor that cuts through the monotony. So, and the primary delivery vehicle for that salt is bacon. But you must banish from your mind any modern image of bacon. This is not the thin, crispy, elegantly streaked bacon you get in a diner. This is something far more primal. It comes in huge, unwieldy slabs of side meat, what they call sow belly. It's mostly fat, with a few meager streaks of pink meat running through it like geological strata to preserve it for the long journey. It was cured in an ungodly amount of salt. When Cookie slices a piece off the slab, You can sometimes see the white crystals of salt embedded in the fat. Before it can be cooked, it has to be soaked in water, sometimes for hours, to draw out the excess salt and make it remotely palatable. If you're in a hurry and he cooks it without a proper soak, the resulting meat is so salty, it makes your tongue curl and your eyes water. But the bacon, and more importantly, its grease, is critical. Fat is energy. In a world where your daily life is hard physical labor, walking miles, pushing a stuck wagon, tending to animals, you need every calorie you can get. The bacon is fried up in the morning, and the rendered fat, the liquid gold known as bacon drip pins, is meticulously saved. It's the foundation of the evening gravy. It's used to grease the Dutch oven for the biscuits. It's what you fry your desperation cakes in. A meal without some form of bacon grease feels thin and unsatisfying, lacking the rich, heavy feeling in your stomach that your body has come to equate with a real meal. The quality of the bacon is a constant lottery. It was packed in barrels, often with bran or sawdust to absorb moisture. But this was an imperfect system. As the journey wears on, the bacon near the edges of the slab, exposed to air and moisture, begins to spoil. Cookie will trim off the greenish, fuzzy parts, but he can't get all of it. A faint, rancid taste starts to creep into the meat. It's a sour, slightly tangy flavor that signals the fat is turning. At first, this taste is horrifying. It's the flavor of decay. But after weeks on the trail, a strange thing happens. You get used to it. Your standards drop so low that as long as the bacon doesn't make you immediately sick, you accept it. You learn to embrace the rancid tang as just another part of the flavor profile, alongside the overwhelming saltiness and the smokiness from the campfire. This leads to a little-known culinary term from the period, rusty bacon. Bacon that had started to turn was called rusty. The term likely came from the reddish-brown or orange streaks that would sometimes appear on the fat as it oxidized. For cowboys on a long trail drive, rusty bacon was not just common, it was expected. A trail cook's skill was oft unjudged by his ability to make rusty bacon edible, usually by boiling it first before frying, a process that rendered out some of the spoiled fat and moderated the flavor. The historical debate here centers on nutrition, specifically the lack of it. While the pioneer diet was heavy on calories from fat and simple carbohydrates, it was catastrophically deficient in essential vitamins. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant threat, though it was less common on the plains than on long sea voyages. Still, pioneers suffered from a host of malnutrition-related ailments, sores that wouldn't heal, aching joints, and a general state of exhaustion and malaise that they called lassitude. Some historians argue that the pioneers' famous grit and resilience were partly a myth, and that many were operating in a state of chronic, low-level sickness due to their terrible diet. They weren't stoic. They were simply too tired and malnourished to be anything else. One day, your wagon train is lucky. A rider from a nearby military fort barters with your trail boss. They have an excess of salt pork and are willing to trade for some of your coffee. The deal is struck. The salt pork is even saltier and tougher than your bacon. But it's a change. It's a new texture. A different kind of pig. That night, Cookie boils the salt pork for a long time before dicing it and adding it to the beans. As you eat your meal, you find a small piece of pork in your spoonful of beans. You chew it slowly. It's tough, requiring a significant effort from your jaw, but it's also dense and savory. It tastes of something other than rancid fat and smoke. It tastes, for a moment, like real meat. You search through the rest of your beans, hoping to find another piece, like a child searching for a prize in a cereal box. That small, tough, incredibly salty piece of boiled pork is the most exciting culinary event you've had in a month. It's a sad, pathetic feast, but right now, it feels like a banquet. You save the last little morsel, eating it by itself at the very end of your meal, trying to make the meager pleasure last as long as possible. There is one ritual that holds the whole fragile enterprise together, one constant in a world of dust and disappointment. It happens every morning, without fail, and it's the first thing you truly participate in. It's the coffee. This isn't coffee as you've ever known it. It's not a delicate beverage to be sipped from a porcelain cup. It's a raw, powerful, life-giving sludge that you drink from a battered tin cup. It's the fuel that pries your eyes open in the cold, pre-dawn darkness, and gives you the will to face another 16 miles of walking. You bought your coffee beans green, hard little pellets that look more like pebbles than anything else. Every few days, it's someone's job to roast them. This is a delicate operation. You take a skillet, get it hot over the fire, and toss the green beans in. You have to keep them moving constantly, shaking the pan, so they roast evenly and don't burn. The beans start to smoke and crackle, turning from pale green to a warm tan, then to a rich, dark brown. The smell is incredible. In a world that mostly smells of dust, sweat, and dung, the aroma of roasting coffee is a brief, intoxicating luxury. If you let them go for a second too long, they turn black, and the resulting coffee will be bitter and acrid. It's a fine wine. Once roasted, the beans are put into a canvas bag and crushed. There are no fancy grinders here. The preferred method is using the butt of a pistol or a rock. You pound the beans into a coarse, uneven powder. Then, it all goes into the massive communal coffee pot. And by all, I mean all, the ground coffee, the chunks that didn't get ground properly, and all the finest. Cookie fills the pot with water, whatever gritty river water is available, and sets it on the fire to boil. He doesn't use a filter. He just lets it bubble and churn. A chaotic brown maelstrom. The result is a brew that is incredibly strong, thick, and gritty. When he pours you a cup, the bottom is a thick layer of what the cowboys called mud. You learn to drink it carefully, sipping from the top and stopping before you get to the sludge at the bottom. Or you just accept your fate and chew the last few sips. This is where you encounter one of the most bizarre and widely practiced tricks of the Chuckwagon, the egg, to help settle the grounds. A trail cook would often crack a whole raw eggshell and all into the pot with the coffee grounds before adding the water. The theory was that the egg white would clarify the coffee as it cooked, and the shell, being calcium carbonate, would reduce the bitterness of the brew. This practice is so strange and specific that it's almost certainly based on some real, observable effect. Modern coffee connoisseurs might recoil in horror, but food historians find it fascinating. It's a piece of folk chemistry, a recipe born of pure pragmatism. Does it work? The academic consensus is that the egg whites do indeed act as a fining agent, binding to the grounds and helping them sing, much like is done in a classic starch consomme. The shell's effect on acidity is more debatable, but chemically plausible. So, your morning cup is not just coffee. It's coffee boiled with eggshells and silt, a true taste of the trail. Sometimes, if the water is particularly alkaline, a condition common on the plains, the coffee takes on a strange, almost soapy flavor. They called it Cowboy coffee, and drinking it was a rite of passage. The debate among historians is about the coffee's true role. Was it primarily a source of caffeine, a simple stimulant to keep exhausted people moving, or was its importance more psychological? Some argue that the ritual of the morning coffee was a critical piece of social glue. It was the one moment of the day where the community gathered for a shared, comforting experience before the hardships began. It provided a sense of structure and normalcy in a chaotic world. The warmth of the cup, the jolt of the caffeine, the brief moment of peace before the sun rose, these were powerful psychological anchors. One day, the wagon rain runs out of roasted beans, and it's pouring rain. Roasting in the open is impossible. Morale plummets. The morning is grim and silent. People move sluggishly, their faces etched with misery. It feels like the world has lost its color. The next day is clear, and the first priority, before anything else, is to roast a new batch of coffee. As the rich aroma finally drifts through the can, you can literally feel the mood lifting. People start talking again. A few jokes are cracked. You take your cup, the hot tin warming your cold hands. You add a spoonful of brown sugar, a carefully guarded luxury. The first sip is glorious. It's hot, strong, and sweet. It's bitter and gritty. It's terrible and it's perfect. It's the taste of survival. You look around at the faces of your fellow travelers, all clutching their own tin cups. and you understand. A coffee isn't just a drink. It's a promise. It's the promise that no matter how bad things get, no matter how tired or hungry you are, tomorrow will begin. And it will begin with this. You've made it. After months of dust, toil, and monotonous food, you have arrived at your destination. It's not a bustling town. Not yet. It's a small, raw settlement. A handful of rough-hewn cabins and sod houses huddled together on the vast, empty plain, looking like they've been dropped there by accident. The Oregon Rail or the Santa Fe Rail is behind you. This is it. This is home. A wave of profound relief washes over you. The constant motion has stopped. You no longer have to wake up and face another day of walking beside a lumbering wagon. You can finally unpack. For good this time, you select your plot of land, the 160 acres promised to you by the Homestead Act. It is a rectangle of wild grass and unyielding soil under an enormous sky. It is both terrifying and magnificent. You imagine your new life, the one from the pamphlets. You'll build a sturdy cabin. You'll plow the fields, and the soil that laughs with a harvest will provide. You'll have a garden overflowing with vegetables, a milk cow, and chickens scratching in the yard. The lean, hungry days of the trail will be a distant memory, a story to tell your grandchildren. But as you unpack the last of your provisions from the wagon, a cold reality begins to set in. The supplies are dangerously low. The 2 sacks of flour you thought would last for months now look pitifully small. The slab of bacon has shrunk to a grist lie. Rancid no. The coffee is almost gone. The dried apples are long gone. The journey took more time and more food than you ever anticipated. Your new kitchen is not the efficient, rolling Chuckwagon. It's a primitive campfire in front of your half-built shelter, or, if you're a sod buster, your first home is literally made of the earth. You plan to farm bricks of prairie sod stacked like blocks. These sod dies were surprisingly well insulated, but were also prone to leaking mud during rains and hosting snakes, mice, and insects in their thick walls. Your kitchen inside this sod house might be a small, smoky fireplace built into one wall. You look around at your fellow settlers. They are all in the same boat. Everyone arrived with the last dregs of their trail supplies, and the fantasy of a land teeming with easily obtainable food quickly evaporates. The buffalo herds, once legendary, have been decimated and are increasingly scarce. The deer are weary and hard to hunt. The wild turkeys you read about are nowhere to be seen. The first winter is the hardest. There has been no time to plant or harvest a crop. The settlement is isolated, with the nearest town or trading post a week's journey away. A journey you can't afford to make in terms of time or money. You are completely reliant on what you have and what you can find. This is where the diet, impossibly, gets even worse than it was on the trail. At least on the trail, you had Cookie, a man whose entire job was to feed you. Now, you are your own cookie, and your larder is bare. Breakfast is a thin cornmeal mush. If you have cornmeal, lunch is nothing. Dinner is more cornmeal mush, maybe with a little molasses for a treat. Meat is a rare luxury. There's a fascinating, and rather grim, historical debate about the so-called starving times in early settlements. Some historians, relying on official records and more optimistic diaries, paint a picture of hardship and scarcity, but not widespread starvation. They argue that communities pulled together, sharing resources, and that hunting, while difficult, provided enough to prevent the worst outcomes. But a different school of thought, drawing from more personal, unpublished letters and oral histories, suggests that these periods were far more desperate than is commonly acknowledged. They point to accounts of settlers boiling barking roots, of children with the distended bellies of malnutrition. They argue that the official narrative was deliberately sanitized to encourage more settlement, glossing over the brutal reality that many early homesteaders quietly starved or abandoned their claims. You learn to see the world through a new, hungry lens. Every plant is a potential food source. You learn from a neighbor which wild roots are edible, which prairie greens won't poison you. You learn to make a bitter, unpleasant tea from dried raspberry leaf, just to have something warm in your stomach that isn't water. One of the strangest and most desperate food sources was the prairie turnip. This wasn't a turnip at all. but the starchy, tuberous root of a native plant. It was a staple for the Plains Indians, who knew how to find and prepare it. For settlers, it was a food of last resort. It was tough, fibrous, and had to be boiled for hours to be edible. It had a bland, earthy taste, but it was filling. Learning to identify the P.S. orale I, esculent a plant and dig for its deep, stubborn root became a critical survival skill. You feel a profound sense of disillusionment. This was not the dream. This was not the land of milk and honey. You have your land, your 160 acres of freedom, but you are more trapped than you ever were back east. You are trapped by your empty stomach, by the vast, indifferent landscape, and by the dawning, terrifying realization that you might not survive to see the spring. The romance of the West has been burned away by the harsh realities of an empty pantry. Spring arrives, not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, messy thaw that turns your patch of earth into a quagmire. But with the warmer weather comes a surge of renewed hope. This is the moment you've been waiting for. This is when you finally get to tickle the earth with a hoe and watch it laugh with a harvest. You are no longer just a settler. You are about to become a farmer. The first task is breaking the sod. The prairie soil is nothing like the soft, loamy earth you might have known back east. The grass here has grown for millennia, its roots forming a dense, tangled mat so thick and tough it's like a layer of fill, several inches deep. Pushing a plow through it is brutal, back-breaking work. It requires a team of strong oxen and a special, heavy plow called a sod buster. You guide the plow as the oxen strain, the sharp blade slicing into the earth with a sound like tearing fabric. You wrestle huge, heavy ribbons of sod, flipping them over to expose the dark soil underneath. Your hands, soft from a life you can barely remember, are soon covered in blisters that break, bleed, and turn into thick calluses. You finally manage to clear a small plot. It looks rough and uneven, but it's yours. Now, what to plant? Your choices are limited by what seed you are able to bring, or what you can barter for from your neighbors. The staples are corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of Native American agriculture, a combination that works well together. You also plant some potatoes, if you were lucky enough to get some seed potatoes, and maybe some turnips or cabbage. You carefully plant your precious seeds in the newly turned soil, your heart filled with a farmer's prayer for sun and rain. At first, things seemed to go well. Tiny green shoots spoke through the soil, a miraculous sight that makes all the hard work feel worthwhile. You tend to your small field with a fierce, parental devotion, pulling weeds, carrying precious water from the creek. You watch the corn stalks grow taller, the bean vines climb, and the squash plants spread their broad leaf. For the first time in a long time, you feel a sense of genuine optimism. You are not just surviving, you are building. You are growing your own food. Then, one hot, still afternoon, you notice a strange shimmer on the western horizon. It's a dirt cloud, but it's not a rain cloud. It moves in a strange, undulating way, and as it gets closer, you hear a low, humming, clicking sound. A neighbor, who has been here a year longer than you, sees the look on your face. Grasshoppers, he says, his own face grim. It's not just a few grasshoppers. It's a plague, a living, moving, devouring cloud of them. Billions upon billions of Rocky Mountain locusts. The sky darkens as they pass over. The sun blotted out. The sound is deafening. A relentless, clicking, chewing roar. They descend on your field. You run out, waving your arms, shouting, trying to beat them away with a sack. But it's like trying to stop a flood with a teaspoon. They cover everything. They blanket the corn stalks, which sag and break under their weight. They shred the leaves of your bean and squash plants. They eat everything green. In a matter of hours, it's over. The swarm moves on, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Your beautiful green field is gone, reduced to chewed up, leafless stalks and bare dirt. They have eaten the crop, the weeds, the leaves off the few small trees near the creek. Some settlers claimed they would even eat the clothes off the line and the wooden handles of their tools. You stand in the ruins of your field, in a stunned, silent despair. Oh, that work, oh, that hope, eaten, devoured in a single afternoon. The laughing harvest has become a bitter, mocking joke. This devastation by locusts is a well-documented part of pioneer life. But there's a lesser note, almost bizarre, coda to it. What did people do after the locusts left? In some of the most desperate communities, they ate the locusts. They would gather them by the bucketful, then roast or boil them. Sometimes they were ground into a dark, oily flour to be mixed with cornmeal. This practice, known as entomophagy, was a feature of many cultures. But for the European settlers, it was a mark of absolute, rock-bottom desperation. Accounts describe the taste as being something like shrimp, but the psychological barrier was immense. The historical debate here concerns the government and railroad response to these natural disasters. Promoters of settlement, like the railroad companies who sold land to settlers, actively downplayed the risks of drought, hail, and locusts. Their pamphlets and advertisements continued to paint a rosy picture of an agricultural paradise. Some historians argue this was deeply cynical and irresponsible, luring people into a situation for which they were unprepared. Others argue that this was simply the nature of 19th century boosterism, and that the settlers themselves bore the responsibility for believing such optimistic claims. They contend it was a buyer beware world, and the pioneers were not naive victims, but risk-takers who knew the gamble they were making. You will not eat the locusts, not yet. You look at your ruined field and the empty sky. The promise of the soil has been broken. You are back where you started, with an empty larder and a long, hungry winter ahead. But this time, it's worse. This time, you've lost more than just a crop. You've lost a piece of your own spirit. Your constant, gnawing hunger drives you to look at the world with new eyes. Every patch of green, every berry on a bush, is no longer just scenery. It's a potential meal. Your farming efforts have failed and hunting is unreliable, so you must now turn to the oldest form of sustenance, foraging. You become a student of the prairie, learning its secret language of edible plants. This is not a romantic stroll through a lush forest, gathering sweet berries. The Great Plains is a harsh environment, and its edible plants are often as tough and stubborn as the land itself. Your education begins with a mix of trial, error, and precious advice from the few neighbors who have some knowledge, or from the occasional friendly interaction with local Native American women who possess a deep, ancestral understanding of this ecosystem. You learn to recognize the broad, arrow-shaped leaves of the wild onion. Finding a patch of them feels like striking gold. You dig them up carefully. Their pungent, sharp smell a glorious shock to your senses. You bring them back to your cabin and chop them into everything. Your cornmeal mush, your rabbit stew, even just chewing one raw for the sheer, overwhelming burst of flavor. For a few days, your food tastes like something other than salt and desperation. You learn about lamb's quarters, a common weed that you would have scorned back east. Out here, you gather its tender young leaves and boil them. Much like spinach, they have a mild, pleasant, green taste. It feels incredibly nourishing to eat something fresh and leafy after months of dry, preserved, and starchy foods. Berries are a rare and cherished treat. You find patches of wild raspberries or choke cherries along the creek beds. Choke cherries are a perfect example of a pioneer food. They are almost inedible raw. They are incredibly tart and astringent, making your mouth pucker and feel dry. Hence the name. But if you gather enough of them, you can cook them down with a bit of precious sugar or molasses into a thick, dark, syrupy jam. The cooking process tames their bitterness and transforms them into a sublime, intensely flavorful treat. Spreading a spoonful of this home-made kokiri jam on a stale biscuit is the height of luxury. This is where you might encounter the ground cherry, a lesser-known but fascinating wild edible, related to the tomatito. This small fruit grows inside a papery husk. When ripe, it drops to the ground and has a unique, sweet tart flavor that some have compared to a cross between a pineapple and a tomato. Finding a patch of these was a true delight, a source of natural candy on the prairie. However, like many plants in the nightshade family, the unripe fruit and leaves are toxic. So knowing exactly when and how to harvest, it was critical knowledge. The historical debate around foraging focuses on the transfer of knowledge. How did settlers who came from a completely different agricultural tradition, learned to identify and use these native plants. One theory emphasizes a process of dangerous trial and error, documented in diaries with tragic accounts of families getting sick or dying from eating misidentified plants. Another school of thought gives more credit to the role of Native Americans, arguing that much of the settlers' foraging knowledge was directly or indirectly learned from them. These historians suggest that the narrative of the rugged, self-sufficient pioneer figuring it all out on their own erases the crucial contributions of indigenous knowledge, which was often shared despite the growing conflict and tension between the two groups. Your foraging education is not without its mistakes. One day, you find some attractive white berries that look similar to the edible buffalo berries you've seen others collect. You eat a few. Within an hour, you are violently ill, racked with stomach cramps and vomiting. You spend a miserable night on the floor of your cabin, convinced you have poisoned yourself. You survive, but the lesson is learned with brutal efficiency. The prairie is not a forgiving teacher. As you become more adept, your daily life changes. Your walks are no longer just for travel or hunting. They are foraging expeditions. Your eyes are constantly scanning the ground, the bushes, the edges of the creek. You learn to read the subtle signs of the seasons, knowing when the wild plums will be ripe or when the best time to dig for starchy roots is. You are building a mental map of your 160 acres, not of landmarks, but of resources. That patch of ground near the big rock is where the wild onions grow. The thicket down by the river is where the choke cherries are. This knowledge feels more valuable than any deed or title. It is a practical, life-sustaining wisdom that connects you to this place in a way that just owning it never could. You are still hungry. Most of the time, a handful of berries and some boiled greens are not enough to fill a stomach accustomed to hard labor. But it's something. It's variety. It's vitamins. And more than that, it's a small measure of control. When your farm fails and the game disappears, the earth itself can still offer some small, humble gift, if you are patient and clever enough to know where to look. The devastation of your crops forces you to reevaluate your relationship with the land. The soil has betrayed you, so you must turn to the creatures that walk upon it. You must become a hunter. The dream of the self-sufficient farmer is dead for now. Long live the gritty, resourceful survivor. Your primary weapon is not a fancy, long-range buffalo rifle. Those were expensive and so was the ammunition. Your weapon is likely an old, Smuthherber musket, perhaps a relic from a past war, or a simple, cheap shotgun. It's not accurate over long distances, but it's versatile. It can fire a single solid ball for larger game, or a spray of small pellets, cold shot, for smaller creatures. Given the scarcity of large animals, you find yourself using the shot more often than not. You envision yourself as a mighty hunter, tracking a majestic buck through the wilderness and bringing it down with a single, well-placed shot. The reality is far less glamorous. The deer are clever and shy, and the open plains offer little cover for a clumsy, inexperienced hunter. The few buffalo that remain are far away, and hunting them is a dangerous, specialized task for which you are not equipped. So, you hunt what you can find, and what you can find are small, fierce, and often unsatisfying creatures. You become a hunter of squirrels. You learn to walk silently through the sparse groves of trees along the creek beds, your eyes scanning the branches. A squirrel, when cooked, provides a few mouthfuls of stringy, dark meat. It's barely a meal, but it's meat. It's a taste of something other than corn and salt. You learn to hunt rabbits. They are plentiful, but quick. You spend hours walking the plains, hoping to flush one from its hiding place in the tall grass. A successful rabbit hunt feels like a major victory. The meat is lean and has a faintly gamey flavor. You learn to cook it slowly in a stew, trying to make the meager amount of meat stretch as far as possible, using the broth to flavor your cornmeal. When the squirrel and rabbit population dwindles from overhunting by the settlement, you turn to even less desirable prey. You become a hunter of prairie dogs. The plains are dotted with their towns, complex networks of burrows. The creatures themselves are plump, but they are wary. They sit at the edge of their burrows, ready to dive underground at the slightest sign of danger. Hunting them is a game of patience, lying still for an hour or more, waiting for one to pop its head up within range of your shotgun. Many of your neighbors refuse to eat them, considering them oversized rats. But hunger is a powerful motivator. You learn to skin them, clean them, and stew them, just like a rabbit. The meat is greasy and has a strong, earthy taste you have to learn to ignore. This is where you stumble upon a truly strange and little-known food source of a desperate frontier. The rattlesnake. The plains are full of them. Your first instinct, like any sane person, is to fear and avoid them. But one day, an old trapper who is passing through shows you how to safely kill and prepare one. He pins its head with a forked stick, then quickly severs it. He shows you how to skin it, revealing a long to both pale, surprisingly dense meat. Tastes like chicken, he says with a grin, repeating the age-old lie about any strange meat. You cook it yourself one night, frying the small sections of meat in a bit of precious lard. It doesn't taste like chicken. It has a unique texture, slightly chewy and firm, and a flavor that is hard to describe. A little like fish, a little like frog legs. It's not bad. It's just snake. Eating it feels like a transgression, a final surrender of your old world sensibilities. The historical debate here revolves around the environmental impact of this subsistence hunting. One school of thought argues that the settlers' hunting practices were catastrophic for the local ecosystem, lacking the conservationist mindset of many Native American cultures. They hunted indiscriminately, quickly depleting the local populations of game, both large and small. This created a boom and bust cycle, where a settlement would thrive for a short time before hunting itself into a state of scarcity. Another perspective is more sympathetic, arguing that it's unfair to judge desperate, starving people by modern ecological standards. They contend that settlers did what they had to do to survive, and their impact, while significant locally, was a drop in the bucket compared to the organized, industrial-scale slaughter of the buffalo for their hides, which was happening concurrently. As you sit by your fire, gnawing on the last bit of meat from a prairie dog bone, you reflect on your new life. You came here to be a tiller of the soil, a man of peace and cultivation. Instead, you've become a creature of opportunity, a scavenger. You are learning the hard calculus of survival, the number of calories in a squirrel versus the cost of a shotgun shell. You look at your hands, stained with dirt and blood. They are not the hands of the farmer you dreamed of being. They are the hands of a stranger, a harder, leaner, hungrier version of yourself. You are no longer just a pioneer. You are becoming a predator. In the vast, empty West is your hunting ground. Just when you think your diet cannot get any more monotonous, a new technology arrives in the settlement, brought by a traveling peddler with a wagon full of goods. It's not a new plow or a better rifle. It's the tin can, canned food. It seems like a miracle. In your small, isolated world, the idea of preserving fresh food for months or even years, perfectly sealed in a metal container, is revolutionary. The peddler has a small, precious stock, canned peaches, canned tomatoes, canned oysters, and something simply labeled roast beef. The cans themselves are heavy and crude. They don't have the thin, popped-up lids of the future. They are thick cylinders of tin-plated iron, sealed with a blob of lead solder. There are no paper labels with beautiful pictures, just a simple stamp in the metal indicating the contents. They are incredibly expensive. A single can of peaches costs more than you would have spent on a week's worth of food back east. But the temptation is overwhelming. To taste a peach in the middle of a bleak, windswept winter, what could be more magical? You trade a good rabbit pelt and 2 of your carefully hoarded shotgun shells for 1 can of peaches and 1 can of the mysterious roast beef. It feels like an insane extravagance, but it's a gamble on hope, a purchase meant to feed your soul as much as your stomach. You save the cans for a special occasion. A few weeks later, when the winter winds are howling and your spirits are at their lowest, you decide the time has come. The first challenge is opening the can. There are no can openers. The instructions, sometimes stamped on the can itself, were chillingly simple. Cut round the top with a chisel and hammer. You place the can of peaches on your rough wooden table. Hold a chisel to the lid. and give it a solid whack with the back of your axe. It's a loud, clumsy, and slightly dangerous operation. After several jarring hits, you manage to puncture the lid and laboriously cut a ragged hole in the top. You peer inside, suspended in a thick, sugary syrup are pale, almost ghostly half-moons of peaches. You spear one with the tip of your knife and lift it out. It is soft, almost mushy, but as you put it in your mouth, you are hit with an explosion of pure, unadulterated sweetness. It's a taste you haven't experienced in so long, you almost forgot it existed. It's the taste of sunshine, of summer, of a world without hardship. You and your family share the can, passing it around, each person taking one precious slice at a time, savoring every drop of the sweet syrup. It is the most delicious thing you have eaten in a year. A week later, you decide to open the roast beef. You go through the same chiseled and hammer ritual. As you pry open the lid, you are met with a less appetizing sight. Inside is a solid, gelatinous mass of grayish-brown meat, packed in a thick, congealed gravy. The smell is strained, not exactly spoiled, but not exactly fresh either. It has a metallic, cooked tin aroma. Still, it's meat. You scoop the mass into your pot, heat it over the fire, and serve it. It's salty, stringy, and has a weird, unidentifiable flavor. It's not the roast beef of your memory, but it fills your stomach with something warm and protein-rich. You are lucky. Your canned food lottery was a success, but it was a lottery, and many were not so fortunate. This is where you encounter the dark side of this new technology. The early canning industry was completely unregulated. Canners were known to use low-quality, often semi-spoiled meat and produce. The canning process itself was often imperfect. If the food wasn't heated to a high enough temperature before sealing, it could harbor a hidden, deadly danger. Botulism. A can could look perfectly fine, but inside, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria could have produced its lethal neurotoxin. A family might enjoy a can of what seemed like perfectly good green beans for dinner, only to fall ill and die a few days later from paralysis and respiratory failure. This leads to a grim, little-known piece of frontier advice. Chuck the can. People learned to be wary of cans that were swollen or bulging, a sign of gas produced by bacteria inside. They learned to be suspicious of any can that didn't make a whoosh sound of inrushing air when punctured. But these were not foolproof methods. The fear of ptomaine poisoning, the 19th century catch-all term for food poisoning, was very real. The historical debate here concerns the impact of canned goods on westward expansion. Did this new technology help tame the West by providing a stable, efficient food source that allowed settlements to survive the first difficult years? Some historians argue yes, that canned goods were a crucial logistical element, bridging the gap between the end of trail supplies and the first successful harvests. Others argue that their impact is overstated. They were too expensive, too unreliable, and too dangerous to have been a major factor for the average homesteader. They contend that canned goods were more of a luxury for military officers, railroad surveyors, and wealthier townsfolk, and that the real story of pioneer survival remained one of cornmeal, salt pork, and for aged grains. You did not know it at the time, but the lead solder used to seal your cans could also leach into the food, leading to slow, cumulative lead poisoning. The symptoms irritability, fatigue, abdominal pain were often just attributed to the general hardship of frontier life. You just knew that your can of peaches was a moment of pure joy, and your can of beef was a strange but filling meal. You won the canned food lottery this time, but as you bury the empty, heavy tin cans outside your cabin, you can't help but wonder if it's a gamble you'd be willing to take again. Word spreads through the territory like a fever. Gold, not the metaphorical gold of a bountiful harvest, but real, yellow, glittering gold, discovered in the gravel of a creek bed in the mountains. A few weeks' journey from your settlement, the news ignites a dormant spark of greed and adventure in the hearts of men who have been beaten down by the grim realities of homesteading. The dream of the patient farmer is instantly replaced by the frantic dream of the get-rich-quick prospector. You watch his neighbors abandon their half-built cabins on unplowed fields, Packing a mule with a few basic tools, a picasse, a shovel, a gold pan, and heading for the hills. The temptation is enormous. After a year of backbreaking labor with nothing to show for it but calusas and an empty pantry, the idea of finding a fortune in a single day is intoxicating. Against your better judgment, you decide to join them. You'll just go for a few months. You tell yourself, find enough to buy proper tools, a milk cow, and enough supplies to see you through the next winter. You arrive in a chaotic, makeshift mining camp that has sprung up overnight in a rocky canyon. It's a city of tents and rough shacks, populated by a wild mix of hopeful homesteaders, experienced miners from California, and shadowy figures looking to make a quick buck off the miners themselves. The mood is one of manic energy, fueled by rumors and whiskey. Every day, someone claims to have struck the motherlode, sending a fresh wave of frenzy through the camp. Your life now revolves around the creek. You stand for hours in the ice-cold mountain water, your back aching. You scoop gravelons and into your flat, middle pan. You swirl the water and sediment together in a practiced motion, a technique you learned by watching the veterans. The idea is to use the water in the pan's shallow ridges to wash away the lighter sand and pebbles, leaving the heavier materials behind. With every swirl, your heart pounds with anticipation. You examine the last few grains of blacks, and at the bottom of the pan, your eyes straining to see a telltale glint of yellow. Most days, you find nothing. The work is grueling, wet, and cold, and the food is even worse than what you left behind. Here, there are no gardens, no hunting grounds. Every scrap of food has to be packed in on the back of a mule, and its price is astronomical. A single pound of flour can cost 100 times what it did back east. The diet of a prospector is the diet of the trail, stripped down to its barest, most miserable essentials. Your daily ration is coffee, bacon, and a hard, chewy bread product called a flapjack. This is not a light and fluffy pancake. It's a dense, greasy disk of flour, water, and bacon fat, cooked in a skillet over an open fire. It's heavy, it's durable, and it provides the raw calories needed for a day of hard labor in cold water. You eat flapjacks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes, for variety, you crumble them into a cup of coffee. This is where you truly understand the hierarchy of needs. You came here seeking wealth, but you spend most of your time and energy just trying to secure enough food to keep going. The gold is the drain. The flapjack is the reality. This extreme reliance on a few basic, expensive staples lead to some infamous stories of prospectors' folly. Men would spend their last pinch of gold dust not on a better tool, but on a can of peaches or a jar of pickles, the craving for a different taste overwhelming their financial sense. There's an ongoing historical debate about the economic reality of the average prospector. The popular image is of the lucky few who struck it rich. But was this a viable path to prosperity for anyone? Or was it more like a lottery that preyed on the desperate? Most academic historians argue the latter. They have analyzed mining camp records and found that the vast majority of individual prospectors found little to no gold. They often ended up broke, in debt to the camp store owner who charged them exorbitant prices for food and supplies. The real money, in a gold rush, they contend, was made not by the miners, but by the merchants who mined the miners. You are living this reality. After a month of backbreaking work, the total amount of gold you have found is a few tiny flakes, barely enough to fill the tip of your fingernail. It's not enough to buy a week's worth of food. Your clothes are ragged, your body is racked with aches, and you are slowly starving. The initial excitement of the camp has curdled into a quiet, grim desperation. You see it in the hollow eyes of the other men. The ultimate symbol of this desperation was the 4-pound loaf. In some of the more remote and starved-out mining camps, a story, perhaps apocryphal, emerged of a baker who would sell a massive 4-pound loaf of bread for an ounce of gold. The loaf was a legend, a symbol of unimaginable wealth and satiety. To be able to afford the 4-pound loaf meant you had made it. You, with your few pathetic flakes of gold, can barely afford a handful of flour. You finally admit defeat. This is not the path to your fortune. This is a path to a lonely, hungry death in a cold canyon. with a heavy heart. You trade your Pecoscan gold pan to the camp store owner for a small sack of flour and a piece of salt pork. It's just enough to get you back to your homestead. The journey back is one of profound shame and failure. You left your land seeking a shortcut, a quick fix. You are returning with nothing but the bitter knowledge that there are no shortcuts in the West. There is only the slow, hard work you tried to escape. You make it back to your settlement, humbled and hungry, your dreams of gold dust replaced by the more practical dream of a full stomach. Your failed adventure as a prospector has cost you precious time and resources, but it has also connected you with a wider world of Western travelers, including soldiers, surveyors, and long-haul freighters, and through them, you're introduced to the single most infamous, iconic, and indestructible food item of the 19th century, hardtack. You are given your first piece by a weary soldier passing through. It doesn't look like food. It's a square, off-weight cracker, about 3 inches by 3 inches and half an inch thick. It is incredibly dense and heavy for its size. You can see a pattern of small holes punched into its surface, which you later learn is to help it bake evenly. The soldier calls it sheet iron into dollar, and he's not joking. You try to bite into it. It's a mistake. It's like biting a piece of lumber. Your teeth ache with the effort, and you've barely made a dent. The soldier laughs and shows you the proper way to eat it. You must not, under any circumstances, attempt to chew it dry. The only way to consume hardtack is to break it up and soften it. He takes a piece, places it on a rock, and smashes it into smaller chunks with the butt of his knife. Then, he drops the chunks into his tin cup of hot coffee. You follow his example. The hardtack chunks sink to the bottom of your coffee and sit there, stubbornly refusing to dissolve. After several minutes of stirring and prodding with your spoon, they begin to soften, absorbing the hot liquid and swelling into a mushy porridge like sludge at the bottom of your cup. You take a tentative spoonful. The taste is nothing. It's the pure, unadulterated taste of baked flour and water, with a faint, dusty hint of the canvas sack it's been stored in for months. There is no salt, no sugar, no flavor of any kind. It is the most profoundly neutral food you have ever experienced, but it's filling. The dense, starchy slurry sits in your stomach with a comforting weight. Hardtack was a military staple, the foundation of the Union Army's rations during the Civil War, and its use continued in the Frontier Army for decades. It was prized for its near-infinite shelf life, made from just flour, water, and sometimes a bit of salt. It was baked until all moisture was gone, making it impervious to mold and spoilage. A piece of hardtack from the 1862, if kept dry, is still perfectly edible today, a fact that museum curators can attest to. This indestructibility was its greatest virtue and its greatest curse, because it lasted forever. Soldiers were oft eating hardtack that was years, or even decades, old. This led to its most notorious problem, infestations. The hardtack crackers were oft unriddled with insect larvae, typically from weevils or moths. This is where the cracker gets its most famous, unappetizing nicknames: worm castles and maggot palaces. The soldiers developed an arch sense of humor about it. They would tap the cracker on a plate before soaking it, to knock out some of the livestock. A common joke was to ask whether the hardtack was more nutritious with or without the weevils, as the insects at least provided a bit of protein. This disgusting reality is a well-known fact of Civil War life, but a lesser-known detail is how soldiers determined if their coffee-soaked hardtack was safe to eat in the dark. After they de-smashed it and soaked it, they would hold the cup up. If the things that floated to the surface crawled away, it was just weevils, and they did drink it. If the things didn't move, it might be something worse, and they did be more cautious. It's a grim piece of battlefield folklore. The historical debates surrounding hardtack is not about what it was, but about its psychological impact. Did this incredibly bland, often infested, and difficult to eat food contribute to the lower Allen desertion rates among soldiers on the frontier? Some military historians argue its impact is overstated. Soldiers have always complained about their food and hardtack, for all its faults. was a reliable source of calories that prevented starvation. It was a logistical marvel, even if it was a culinary nightmare. But other historians, focusing on the personal diaries and letters of common soldiers, argue that the sheer, grinding monotony and disgusting nature of the daily ration had a profound and corrosive effect on their mental well-being. It was a constant, physical reminder of their miserable existence, a symbol of the army's indifference to their comfort. You finish your cup of hardtack-laced coffee. It wasn't pleasant, but it was food. You thank the soldier, who grunts in reply and moves on. You didn't enjoy the experience, but you understand it now. Hardtack is not food for living. It's food for not dying. It is the ultimate expression of survival stripped of all pleasure. All comfort, all joy. It is the taste of pure, hard, stubborn existence. And in the West, you're learning that sometimes that's the only taste on the menu. After your brief, humbling encounter with the world of hardtack, you return to the staples of your own kitchen, and you come face to a face with the same problem the soldiers had, but in a slightly different form. You open your precious barrel of flour to bake a batch of biscuits, and you notice something is wrong. The flour seems to be moving. You look closer. The fine white powder is teeming with tiny, dark specks. They are weevils, not just a few, but thousands of them, and along with the adult beetles, you can see their larvae, tiny, pale, squirming worms, no bigger than a grain of rice. Your stomach turns. The last, most reliable part of your food supply, the very foundation of your diet, has been compromised. This was an almost universal experience for anyone relying on stored flour in the 19th century. The flour we buy today is highly processed and stored in climate-controlled, pest-proof conditions. The flour of the 1800 seconds was a different story. It was coarsely milled and often contained dormant, weevil eggs from the moment it was bagged. In the war, humid conditions of a stuffy cabin or the back of a wagon, these eggs would hatch, and a full-blown infestation was inevitable. Your first instinct is to throw the whole barrel out. It feels contaminated, spoiled, disgusting, but you can't. You absolutely cannot afford to. Dead flour, bugs and all, has to last you through the winter. Wasting it would be a death sentence. So, you have to learn to deal with it. You learn the art of sifting. You create a makeshift sifter from a piece of cheesecloth stretched over a wooden frame. You pour the flour through it, shaking it gently. The finer flour passes through, while the larger adult weevils and some of the larvae are caught in the cloth. You scrape the collected bugs into the fire, trying not to think about it too much, but the sifter doesn't catch the eggs or the smallest larvae. You know they are still in your flour. You have to find a way to make peace with this fact. You adopt the same dark humor as the soldiers with their hardtack. Extra protein. You mutter to yourself as you mix the sifted flour with water to make your dough. The West's little seasoning. The Swedes to a little known, and rather clever, bit of kitchen science used by pioneer women. How do you make bread that doesn't show the little black specks of cooked weevils? You can't get them all out, so you add something to camouflage them. If you had access to it, you might add cornmeal, which had its own texture and color variations. A more common trick was to add a bit of ginger, cinnamon, or other dark spice to the dough. This would turn the bread a brownish color, making the cooked insects much less visible. A spice cake in a pioneer kitchen wasn't always a sign of luxury. Sometimes it was a sign of a buggy flour barrel. You also learn that the bugs have a preference. They tend to congregate at the top of the barrel, where the air and moisture are. The flour at the very bottom is often, but not always, relatively clean. So you learn to use the top flour for things where the bugs will be less noticeable, dark gravies or heavily seasoned stews, and you save the bottom flour for your more respectable biscuits. The historical debate here touches upon the role of women and domestic management on the frontier. The traditional narrative often focuses on the male activities of plowing, hunting, and building, but was the daily, unglamorous work of managing a severely compromised food supply just as crucial for survival. Some historians argue that the ingenuity and resilience of pioneer women in the kitchen, their ability to make infested food palatable, to stretch meager resources. To combat spoilage was the single most important factor in a family's success or failure. They weren't just helping, they were performing a complex, skilled job that was central to the entire homesteading enterprise. Others might see this as simply a part of the expected domestic duties of the era, important but not uniquely heroic. One evening, you are making a batch of biscuits. You've sifted the flour as best you can, but you're tired and distracted. You don't inspect the dough as closely as you should. You bake the biscuits and serve them. As you bite into one, you see it, a small, dark, cooked speck, unmistakably a weevil. For a moment, you feel that old, familiar wave of disgust. You think back to your life before this, a life where food was clean and easy and came from a shop. But then, you look around your small cabin. You see the faces of your family, eating their own biscuits without complaint. They are hungry. They are alive. You swallow the bite of biscuit, weevil and all. It doesn't taste like anything. It's just a part of the bread now. You have adapted. Your standards have been ground down and remade by the harsh realities of this new life. You've learned the final, most difficult lesson of the pioneer kitchen. You eat what you have, not what you want, and you learn to not look too closely. The winter deepens. The snow piles up in great drifts outside your small cabin, isolating you completely. The wind howls a constant, mournful song. The last of the hunted squirrel and rabbit is gone. The flour barrel, weevils and all, is almost empty. The cornmeal is down to a few handfuls. You are entering the true starving time. The hunger is no longer a delay. It's a shock, painful, and constant presence. Your days are spent in a lethargic daze, trying to conserve every calorie. You huddle by the fire, feeding it with scraps of wood you gathered before the snows came. The cold seeps in through the cracks in the cabin walls. Your mind grows foggy, and you find yourself staring into the flames for hours. It is in this state of profound desperation that you start to hear the stories. They are whispered around the settlement, grim legends of last resort survival. The most famous and unsettling of these is the story of cooking your own leather. You hear about a group of prospectors, trapped by an early blizzard in the mountains, who survived by boiling their moccasins and eating them. You hear of a family who boiled their leather satchel into a soup. At first, it sounds insane. Leather is not food. It's the cured, tanned hide of an animal, treated with chemicals to make it durable and inedible to pests. But as the hunger gnaws at you, the idea starts to seem less crazy. It starts to make a strange, desperate kind of sense. Leather is, after all, made of animal skin. It's protein, and right now, you would kill for protein. You'd have a pair of old, worn-out leather boots, the ones you walked across the plains in. The soles are gone, and the leather is cracked and stiff. They are useless as footwear now. You look at them, lying in a corner of the cabin. You look at the hollow faces of your family. The decision is made. The process is a grim, laborious parody of cooking. First, you have to prepare the leather. You cut away the hardest, most inedible parts, the sole, the heel. You are left with the upper part of the boot. You scrape off as much dirt and grime as you can. Then, you have to try and remove the hair and any remaining surface treatments. The common method was to singe it over the fire, burning off the hair and creating a charred, blackened surface, which you then scrape away with a knife. The smell is awful, a combination of burning hair and chemicals. Now for the cooking. You put the blackened, scraped pieces of leather into your only pot and cover them with water. You set it over the fire to boil, and boil, and boil. You boil it for hours. The water turns into a murky, brown liquid. The leather itself doesn't seem to change much. It gets a little softer, a little more pliable, but it doesn't break down into a tender stew as you might fantasize. This is where you encounter a little known, and rather disgusting, piece of survival lore. Rock tripe. This wasn't actually tripe, but a type of lichen that grows on rocks in northern climates. When boiled, it produces a gelatinous, unappetizing goo. Desperate pioneers and trappers sometimes mixed this lichen goo with their boiled leather, creating a slightly thicker, if not more palatable, soup. The gelatin from the lichen helped to give the illusion of substance. You don't have any rock tripe. You just have your pot of boot water. After a full day of boiling, you decide it's as done as it's ever going to be. You fish out a piece of the leather. It's hard, rubbery, and smells faintly of feet and smoke. You take a bite. It's like chewing a piece of warm, flavorless rubber. Your teeth can't turn. You just nod, trying to scrape off a few softened fibers. The real food is the broth. You ladle the greasy, brown water into a cup. It's thin, and it tastes like boiled leather. But it's warm and it fills your stomach. It feels like it has some substance, some faint echo of the animal it once was. You and your family drink the broth, then chew on the rubbery hide. In a grim, silent ritual. Did people really do this? The historical evidence is largely anecdotal, found in journals and memoirs of those who survived extreme situations. It's a topic historians approach with caution. Is it a true, widespread survival technique, or is it more of a tall tale, a story exaggerated to emphasize the hardship endured? The consensus seems to be that yes, in the most extreme, life-or-death circumstances, people did attempt to eat their own leather goods. However, the nutritional value is highly debated. Modern analysis suggests that the tanning process makes most of the proteins in leather indigestible to humans. The meager nutrition likely came from residual fats and other tissues that weren't fully removed during tanning. Essentially, drinking the broth was like drinking a very, very thin, very dirty gelatin soup. It might have provided just enough calories to stave off death for another day or two. As you finish your meal, you feel no satisfaction. There is no pleasure in this kind of eating. It is the ultimate act of desperation, a sign that you have reached the absolute bottom. You have literally consumed your own past, your own journey, in a futile attempt to survive the present. You have eaten your boots. You pray for the spring to come. The spring finally arrives, breaking the icy grip of winter. The snow melts. The creeks begin to flow again. And with the thaw comes a trickle of renewed life to the settlement. A supply wagon makes it through, bringing flour and salt. You manage to hunt a rabbit. The memory of boot, leather soup begins to fade, replaced by the immediate, blessed reality of actual food. And with the return of travel and commerce comes the reopening of the settlement's most important social institution, the saloon. The saloon is a rough, one-room cabin, barely bigger than your own, with a few barrels and a plank of wood serving as the bar. It is the center of the community's social life, a place for men to gather, exchange news, play cards, and escape the crushing isolation of their homesteads. And it offers a perk that sounds too good to be true, the free lunch. You hear the whispers about it. After a long day of work, you can go to the saloon, buy a 5-cent beer or a 10-cent whiskey, and get a free meal. After a winter of starvation, the words free lunch are the most beautiful you can imagine. One evening, you decide to see for yourself. You scrape together a few coins, put on your least ragged shirt, and walk to the saloon. You push open the heavy wooden door and are met with a wall of noise, smoke, and the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. You make your way to the bar and order a beer. And there, at the end of the bar, you see it, the free lunch counter. It's not a grand buffet. It's a humble spread, laid out on the wooden plate. There are a few dishes, looking greasy and well handled under the smoky lamplight. There's a bowl of salted crackers. There's a plate of sliced, rubbery-looking cheese. There's a large crock of pickled eggs, floating in a cloudy brine. And the centerpiece, the hot dish, is a big bowl of what looks like a thick, dark chili or stew. Your stomach crumbles. You take a plate and help yourself. The crackers are stale, the cheese is dry, but the stew is hot and savory. It's salty, greasy, and has chunks of unidentifiable meat in it. It's the best thing you've tasted in months. You go back for a second helping. You feel like you discovered the greatest bargain in the world. But as you become a more regular visitor to the saloon, you start to understand the hidden economics of the free lunch. It was not an act of charity. It was a calculated business strategy. The saloon keeper knew that nothing makes a man thirstier than salty food. The crackers were incredibly salty. The cheese was salty. The pickled eggs were pure salt and vinegar. The stew was a soap bomb. The more you ate from the free lunch, the more 5-cent beers you would buy to wash it down. The lunch wasn't free. It was a loss leader, a tool to doctor drink sales. This is where you discover the unwritten, and rather disgusting, truth behind the free lunch. What was in that stew? The saloon keeper was the ultimate recycler. The meat was often whatever was cheapest and on the verge of spoiling. It might be scraps from the local butcher. If there was one, it could be tough, old game that a hunter couldn't sell elsewhere. And, most notoriously, the free lunch was where the leftovers from the previous day's free lunch went. The unit and cheese, the dregs of the stew, anything that could be salvaged, was often just dumped back into the pot for the next day, and boiled again. That rich, dark color of the stew, it might not have been from spices. It might have been from age. The historical debate here centers on the social function of the saloon. Was it, as temperance crusaders claim, a den of iniquity that drained men of their wages and led to violence and moral decay? Or was it a vital, if flawed, social institution that provided lonely, isolated men with a much-needed sense of community and connection? Many modern historians lean toward the latter view. They argue that in a world without theaters, libraries, or community centers, the saloon was the de facto town hall, business office, and social club. The free lunch, in this context, wasn't just a marketing gimmick. It was part of the web of services the saloon provided to establish itself as the center of frontier life. You learned the etiquette of the free lunch. It was considered bad form to just eat and run. You were expected to buy at least one drink, and preferably several. Men who took advantage of the system, piling their plates high and drinking only water, were given the stink-eye and might be unceremoniously thrown out. One evening, you're at the bar, nursing your bear, and you see the saloon keeper clear away the lunch counter. He takes the bowl of stew, which is still half full, and disappears into the back room. A few minutes later, you hear the clatter of him adding new ingredients to the pot for tomorrow. You realize you've probably eaten bits of that same stew, recycled and re-boiled half a dozen times. A wave of nausea, quickly suppressed, passes through you, but you don't stop going. The saloon is warm, it's companionable, and the food is free. You have learned to live with weevils in your flour and dirt in your water. You can certainly learn to live with the mystery of the saloon stew. You just learn to chew thoroughly and not to ask too many questions. After a hearty, if questionable, meal from the free lunch counter, you feel like celebrating your survival of the winter. You decide to move on from the 5-cent beer and treat yourself to the real nectar of the saloon. A shot of whiskey. The saloon keeper slaps a thick, greasy glass on the bar and pours you a measure from a large, unlabeled bottle. The liquid is a pale, yellowish color, and it smells sharp and fiery, with none of the mellow, oaky aroma you might associate with fine spirits. You toss it back. The effect is instantaneous and violent. It's like swallowing fire. A wave of pure, raw heat explodes in your throat and chest, making your eyes water and stealing your breath. This is not a drink for sipping or savoring. This is a weapon. As the initial shock subsides, a powerful, fuzzy warmth spreads through your body, dulling the aches in your back and the anxiety in your mind. It's brutally effective. You have just experienced Tao's lightning, tarantula juice, or one of the many other colorful names for the rot-gut whiskey of the Old West. The romantic image of cowboys drinking smooth, aged bourbon is largely a myth created by Hollywood. The whiskey served in the average frontier saloon was a crude, freshly distilled, and often dangerously adulterated concoction. The base was usually a raw, unaged corn liquor, essentially moonshine. It was cheap to produce, especially in farming communities with a surplus of corn. This white dog, as it was called, was potent and harsh, with a fiery taste and a collection of volatile compounds called congeners that could produce splitting headaches and violent hangovers. But for many saloon keepers, even this was not cheap or strong enough. They were masters of stretching and improving their product. A barrel of raw whiskey would arrive, and the saloon keeper would get to work. First, he would dilute it, often with water from the same questionable sources as everything else. But just adding water made it taste weak. So, he had to add things back in to give it color, flavor, and, most importantly, a kick. This is where things got dangerous. To imitate the amber color of aged whiskey, he might add burnt sugar, molasses, or even a plug of chewing tobacco to add flavor and bite. The list of additives was as creative as it was horrifying. Chili powder, ginger, and cayenne pepper were common, but the most infamous and dangerous additives were used to mimic the potent alcoholic burn. Turpentine, a toxic solvent, was sometimes added for its sharp, piney flavor. Ammonia, a household cleaner, could provide a powerful jolt to the senses, and in the most extreme cases, gunpowder was added to the mix, giving the drink a smoky flavor and a fizz that was supposed to impress the unsophisticated drinker. This wasn't just mixing a drink, it was amateur chemistry, performed with a reckless disregard for human health. The historical debate here concerns the prevalence of these adulterants. Were these horror stories of gunpowder whiskey common? Or were they tall tales exaggerated by temperance reformers to scare people away from drinking? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While not every saloon served poison, the lack of any regulation, combined with the desire to maximize profit, meant that adulteration was rampant. Historians who have studied business records from frontier wholesalers have found invoices for large quantities of these strange additives being shipped to saloons, suggesting the practice was widespread. They argue that mild to moderate poisoning from adulterated liquor was a common, if often undiagnosed, ailment on the frontier, contributing to the general level of sickness and violence. A truly strange, little-known aspect of this whiskey culture was the whiskey ring fraud. In the 1872, a massive conspiracy of distillers and government officials worked to evade federal excise taxes on liquor. They would produce vast quantities of untaxed whiskey, flooding the market with cheap spirits. This meant that the rot that you were drinking was not only potentially poisonous, but also part of a nationwide criminal enterprise that reached the highest levels of government. As you stand at the bar, the warmth from the whiskey spreading through your veins, you feel a sense of camaraderie with the other men. The shared experience of drinking this terrible liquor creates a strange bond. You are all survivors, tough enough to handle the tarantula juice, but you are also victims, slowly pickling your insides with a cocktail of raw alcohol, tobacco spit, and turpentine. The next morning, you wake up on your thin mattress, your head pounding with a ferocity you have never known. Your mouth tastes like a chemical spill. The brief, warm escape of the previous night has been paid for with a day of agonizing, nauseating misery. This, you realize, is the other side of the saloon's coin. It offers a temporary cure for the hardships of the West, but its remedies are often as harsh as the diseases they are meant to treat. You survived the hunger, the weather, and the back-breaking labor. Now you have to learn to survive the cure. After the brutal lesson of the cheap whiskey, you find yourself seeking simpler, less punishing pleasures, and in the harsh, unsweetened world of the frontier, one substance above all others represents pure, unadulterated joy. Sugar. You've almost forgotten what true sweetness tastes like. The memory of York and peaches is a distant, beautiful dream. The molasses you occasionally get is a dark, slightly bitter sweetness. The brown sugar you put in your coffee is a coarse, crude pleasure, but pure, white, refined sugar. That is the ultimate luxury. In the 19th century, sugar was still a relatively expensive commodity. The process of refining sugarcane or sugar beets into the fine white crystals we know today was labor-intensive. Transporting the heavy sacks and barrels across the country made it even more costly. In your small settlement, a pound of white sugar could cost as much as a day's wages, if you could even find a day's wage worth of work. It was not an ingredient for everyday use. It was a treasure to be hoarded and dispensed with ceremonial gravity. The sugar was kept in a special container, a sugar loaf coat, or stored in a locked box to protect it from moisture, pests, and temptation. When a recipe called for sugar, it wasn't measured out in cups, but in carefully considered spoonfuls. A wife might bake a company cake for a special visitor, a rare and extravagant gesture that signaled the guest's importance. A child's birthday might be celebrated with a single piece of hard candy, a treat to be savored for an entire day. The scarcity of sugar led to some creative and Now little-known ways of satisfying a sweet tooth. One of the most common was making vinegar candy. It sounds unappetizing, but it was a simple and ingenious recipe. You would take vinegar, usually apple cider vinegar, and boil it with your coarse brown sugar or molasses. The acid in the vinegar would interact with the sucrose in the sugar, breaking it down in a process called inversion. This prevented the sugar from crystallizing as it cooled, resulting in a smooth, hard candy rather than a grainy mess. The final product had a unique sweet and sour flavor, a popular taste at the time. It was a cheap, durable candy that could be made with the common pantry staples of the frontier. You see this reverence for sugar firsthand when a new family arrives in the settlement. They are slightly better off than most, and the wife is brought with her a small, precious cone of white sugar. Wrapped in blue paper, one afternoon, she invites the other women over for tea. The tea itself is just a brew of local herbs, but the occasion is momentous. She brings out the sugar cone and a special tool called sugar nippers, a small, sharp pair of pliers used for breaking off small chunks from the hard packed loaf. Each woman is given one tiny, irregular lump of pure white sugar for her cup. To you, it feels like a coronation. The simple act of adding a lump of sugar to a bitter herbal tea transforms it into a moment of elegance and civilization. It's a reminder of a world of refinement, a world beyond the mud and dust of your daily existence. The historical debate here concerns the role of sugar in the changing American diet and its connection to social class. Was sugar's status as a luxury a good thing, inadvertently protecting people from the health problems we now associate with its overconsumption? Some food historians argue, somewhat counterintuitively, that the terrible diet of the pioneers, for all its faults, was often a low-sugar diet by necessity. This protected them from rampant tooth decay and the metabolic diseases that would plague later, more prosperous generations. Others argue that this romanticized as poverty. They contend that the lack of sugar was just another deprivation, and that people craved it desperately. They point out that as soon as sugar became cheaper and more available, people consumed it in vast quantities. Its status as a luxury good simply meant that only the wealthy could afford to eat a diet that we would today consider unhealthy. You decide you must have some of this joy for yourself. You perform a day of hard labor for the saloon keeper, not drinking this time, but mending his fence, and you are paid not in coin, but with a small pouch of brown sugar. You carry it home like a bag of gold. That evening, you announce a feast. You make flapjacks, but this time, you mix a generous amount of the precious brown sugar into the batter. You fry them in bacon grease, and the sugar caramelizes, creating a dark, crispy, and incredibly sweet crust. They are the best flapjacks you have ever tasted. They are almost a dessert. As you eat, the pure, simple pleasure of sweetness lights up a part of your brain that has been dormant for a long time. It's a fleeting moment of happiness in a hard life, and you realize that on the frontier, wealth isn't measured in acres of land or flakes of gold. It's measured in moments like this. It's measured in sugar. As your settlement slowly grows, acquiring a few more families and a semi-regular supply wagon, new and more complex food systems begin to emerge. The days of pure subsistence are not over, but now there are small-scale specialists. One man sets up a rudimentary blacksmith shop, another becomes the go-to butcher, and one family, who managed to bring a sickly-looking cow with them, starts selling milk. The idea of fresh milk is intoxicating. After a year of drinking gritty water and black coffee, the thought of a cool, creamy glass of milk is the ultimate symbol of domestic comfort. It represents health, nourishment for the children, and a return to a civilized way of life. You eagerly trade a portion of your hunted game for a pail of this precious white liquid. The milk is not what you expect. It's thin and has a faint bluish tint. It doesn't have the rich, sweet flavor you remember. It tastes salt, watery, and slightly sour, but it's milk, and you are grateful for it. You give it to your children, hoping to put some fat back on their bones. You have just had your first encounter with the widespread 19th century practice of swill milk. This was a problem that plagued growing towns and cities, but its principles applied even in small settlements. A cow needs good pasture to produce good milk. On the frontier, pastureland was often poor or non-existent in the dusty confines of a town. So, what did you feed your cow? You fed it the cheapest possible food source, which was often the spent grain or swill from a distillery or brewery. If your settlement had a saloon that was brewing its own crude beer or distilling its own rot-gut whiskey, the owner would have a constant supply of this wet, fermented, and often rotting mash. It was basically garbage, but cows would eat it. The problem was that a diet of this swill was horribly unhealthy for the animals. The cows became sick, developing sores, rotting teeth, and losing their tails. The milk they produced was of abysmal quality, thin, low in fat, and often filled with pus and bacteria from the cow's constant infections. To make this poor quality milk marketable, the producers would engage in a series of deceptions to hide the thin, bluish appearance. They might add chalk, plaster of Paris, or mashed up sheep's brains to whiten and thicken it. To mask the sour taste, they would add molasses or baking soda. The final product was a chemical cocktail, a dangerous imitation of milk that was sold to an unsuspecting public. The infant mortality rate in areas with a heavy reliance on swill milk was shockingly high, as babies were essentially being fed a slow-acting poison. This leads to a fascinating, though disturbing, historical debate about the birth of public health and food regulation. When did people become aware of these dangers, and what did they do about it? Some historians credit crusading journalists and early scientists, like the famous French chemist Louis Pasteur, for exposing the dangers of contaminated milk and advocating for pasteurization. They see it as a triumph of science and progressive reform over greed and ignorance. However, other historians argue that the push for reform was also driven by economic interests. The established rural dairy industry, which produced cleaner milk, saw the urban swill milk producers as unfair competition. They actively campaigned against them, using the language of public health to advance their own business interests. The pure food movement was, in this view, a complex mix of genuine public concern and cynical corporate rivalry. A lesser-known aspect of the milk problem was the town cow phenomenon. In many small western towns, there were no central dairies. Instead, individual families might own a single cow that they would let wander the streets during the day to forage for whatever grass it could find. This created a constant nuisance, with cows getting into gardens and leaving messes in the street. But it also meant that the quality of milk could vary wildly from house to house, depending on what your neighbor's cow had managed to eat that day. You continued to buy the milk, telling yourself it's better than nothing. But one day, you see the saloon keeper's sickly cow, the source of your milk, tied up behind his establishment, listlessly chewing on a bucket of foul-smelling mash from his brewing operation. The animal looks gaunt and miserable. The realization hits you with the force of a physical blow. You have been feeding your children thus. This is the nourishment you have been so proud to provide. That evening, when the pail of milk is delivered, you look at the thin, chalky liquid, and you can no longer deceive yourself. You take the pail, walk to the door of your cabin, and pour it all out onto the dirt. It's a painful act, wasting something so expensive, but it is also an act of defiance. You will not poison your own family for the illusion of comfort. You will go back to water and black coffee. You will be poor, but you will be safe. You have learned another hard truth of the West. Sometimes the most dangerous things come disguised as civilization. Years have passed since you first arrived. Your cabin is more solid now. It feels a little more productive. You have survived, which is, in itself, a victory. Life is still hard. A constant struggle against drought, pests, and the sheer, grinding work of it all. But you have learned the rhythms of this place, and just when you think you have settled into a permanent state of making do, a new and almost magical substance begins to appear in your life. Ice. This is not the thin, fragile ice that forms on the creek in winter. This is solid, crystalline, miraculously cold ice, available in the middle of a hot, dusty summer. Its arrival feels like a strange and wonderful dream. It comes to the larger towns first, brought by the railroad, but eventually, Even your small settlement gets a taste of it. A man with an insulated wagon, packed with sawdust, starts making trips to the nearest town with a commercial ice house, bringing back huge blocks of it to sell. The ice is harvested in the winter from frozen lakes and rivers in the colder climes of the north. Like New England or the Great Lakes, armies of men would cut the ice into massive, uniform blocks, then float them to huge, windowless, insulated warehouses, packed in sawdust. These blocks could last for months, even through the summer. This was the frozen water trade, a massive and profitable 19th century industry that predated artificial refrigeration. The first time you buy a piece, it's a small, precious block, still covered in sawdust. It costs a ridiculous amount, but you have to have it. You rush it home, wrapped in a thick blanket to slow the inevitable melting. You chip off a few small pieces and put them in a cup of water. You take a sip. The shock of the pure, clean cold is a physical pleasure so intense it almost hurts. It's the cleanest, most refreshing thing you have ever tasted. The water is no longer just a necessity to quench thirst. It's a luxury, a treat. The availability of ice begins to subtly revolutionize your relationship with food. For the first time, you have a way to combat the relentless heat that spoils everything. You build a root cellar, a small underground room dug into the side of a hill, which stays naturally cool. But with ice, you can create a true icebox. It's a simple insulated wooden chest. A large block of ice sits in a compartment at the top, and as the cold air sinks, it keeps the food in the compartments below cool. This simple technology changes everything. For the first time, you can keep milk for more than a day without it souring. You can store butter without it melting into an oily puddle. If you are lucky enough to get a large piece of meat, you don't have to eat or preserve all of it immediately. You can keep it fresh for a few days. This simple ability to slow down the process of decay feels like you are cheating nature itself. A little-known but fascinating application of this new ice technology was in the brewing of beer. Traditional lager beers require a long, cool fermentation period. This meant that in most of the country, lager could only be brewed in the winter. Saloons mostly served quick fermented, less stable ales, but with a steady supply of ice, brewers could create artificially cool lagering cellars and produce crisp, clean lager beer year-round. This transformed the American beer industry and is one of the reasons lager became the dominant style of beer in the country. The historical debate here concerns the democratic nature of this cold revolution. Did the availability of ice benefit everyone equally? Some historians argue that it did, that it was a democratizing force that improved food safety and quality of life for a broad section of the population, even in remote areas. But other historians contend that ice, and the icebox, remained a luxury for the urban and middle class for a very long time. For the poor homesteader or the struggling farmer, the cost of the ice and the icebox was prohibitive. They argue that a cold gap emerged where the wealthy had access to fresh, safe food, while the poor continued to subsist on the traditional diet of salted, smoked, and often spoiled provisions. You are living in this gap. You cannot afford an icebox or a regular supply of ice, but you can afford it as a rare treat on the hottest day of the summer. To celebrate a small success on the farm, you splurge on a block. You don't use it to preserve meat. You use it for something far more important. A celebration. You make lemonade, using precious sugar and lemons brought in by the supply wagon. You chip ice and fill everyone's cups. You even make ice cream. It's a laborious, arm-numbing process. You have a bucket, a smaller metal canister, and a hand crank. You put the cream, sugar, and vanilla mixture in the canister, and you pack the outer bucket with a mixture of ice and salt. The salt lowers the freezing point of the ice, creating a super cold brine that can freeze the cream. You spend what feels like an hour turning the crank. You're making until the liquid finally thickens into a slushy, sweet, frozen miracle. Use it outside your cabin as the sun sets, eating a spoonful of homemade ice cream. The cold, sweet cream melts on your tongue. It is an impossible luxury, a taste of a future you never thought you'd see. You look at the vast, hot plains stretching out before you, and for the first time, You feel like you have a weapon against the heat, against the decay, against the relentless struggle. It's just frozen water. But right now, it feels like progress. It tastes like hope. The single greatest change to your life in the West does not come from a new tool, a new crop, or a new technique. It arrives with a plume of black smoke on the horizon and a sound you haven't heard in years. The lonely, powerful whistle of a steam locomotive. The railroad has finally reached your corner of the world. They call it the Iron Horse, and its arrival is the most significant event since the settlement was founded. A new town springs up almost overnight, a few miles from your homestead, centered around the raw, new trained depot and the water tower that services the engines. The railroad is more than just a way to travel. It is a lifeline, a great artery of commerce and connection that links your small, isolated world to the rest of the nation. And nothing is more transformed by this new connection than your food. Before the railroad, every single item that wasn't produced locally had to be hauled overland by wagon. This was slow, expensive, and unreliable. It meant that only the most durable, non-perishable goods were available. Flour, salt, coffee, bacon. But the train changes the entire equation. It is fast, it is cheap, relatively, and, most importantly, it can carry perishable goods in newly invented refrigerated cars, ice boxes on wheels. You walk into the new general store that has opened by the train depot, and you are stunned. It's like stepping into another world. The shelves are packed with goods you haven't seen in a decade. There are barrels of crisp, fresh apples from orchards in the east. There are crates of oranges and lemons from California, their bright colors looking like jewels in the dusty town. There are wheels of sharp cheddar cheese from Wisconsin, and sacks of potatoes and onions that haven't been sitting in a root cellar for 6 months. And the meat. For the first time, you can buy fresh beef that hasn't been walked 1,000 miles on the hoof. The refrigerated cars allow the great meat packing houses of Chicago and Kansas City to slaughter and process cattle, then ship the fresh meat all over the country. The local butcher can now offer you a steak, a real steak, marbled with fat and red with fresh blood. The change to your diet is revolutionary. You can have a potato with your meal, not as a rare treat, but as a regular staple. You can have an onion to flavor your stew. You can give your child an apple, a simple, crisp, healthy piece of fruit. The constant, grinding threat of malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies begins to recede. The hidden hungers for vitamins and minerals, which you didn't even have a name for, start to be satisfied. This revolution also brought some strange, and now forgotten, culinary fads. One of the most prominent was the oyster craze. Oysters were immensely popular in the 19th century, but they were, of course, a coastal delicacy. The railroad, with its fast refrigerated transport, changed that. Suddenly, even in a dusty, landlocked town in the middle of the plains, you could get fresh oysters, packed in barrels of ice. They became a massive status symbol. Every celeb, every hotel, every aspiring fancy restaurant had to have an oyster bar. Eating a plate of raw oysters in the middle of Nebraska was a way of showing that you were sophisticated, that you were connected to the modern, cosmopolitan world. Of course, the safety of these long-distance oysters was often dubious, but that didn't stop the craze. The historical debate here is about the dark side of this railroad-driven food system. Did it truly improve the lives of small farmers, or did it ultimately hurt them? One side argues that the railroad was a clear benefit. It gave farmers access to new markets for their own crops, like wheat and corn, and it dramatically improved their quality of life by providing access to a wider variety of foods. But another school of thought argues that the railroad created a new kind of dependency. Farmers became reliant on the monopolistic railroads to ship their goods, and they were often charged exorbitant, unfair rates that ate up their profits. Furthermore, the flood of cheap, mass-produced goods from the East often put local artisans and producers out of business. The small, self-sufficient community was being replaced by a new, more fragile economy, beholden to distant corporations and market forces they couldn't control. You experience both sides of this coin. You can now sell your surplus wheat for cash, which feels liberating, But you are also painfully aware that your financial success for the year depends entirely on the freight rates set by a man in an office 1,000 miles away. Tonight, however, you are not thinking about economics. You are thinking about dinner. You have splurged. You bought a small beefsteak into large potatoes. You go home and prepare a meal that would have been an impossible fantasy just a year ago. You fry the steak in a skillet, searing the outside and leaving the inside juicy and pink. You bake the potatoes in the embers of your fire until their skins are crisp and their insides are fluffy. You serve it with a bit of butter you bought at the store, a luxury you can now occasionally afford. You sit down at your table and take the first bite of steak. The rich, savory, beefy flavor is so intense, so real, it almost makes you dizzy. It is the taste of success, not the wild, frantic success of a gold rush, but the slow, hard-won success of endurance. The iron horse has brought many things to your small corner of the world: noise, dirt, complication. But tonight, as you savor a simple meal of steak and potatoes, you know that it has also brought you something else. It has brought you the end of an era. The era of survival cooking is over. The era of just cooking has begun. It's a Sunday afternoon, years after the arrival of the railroad. The raw, dusty settlement has grown into a proper town with a church, a school, and a street with more than one store. Your own homestead has prospered. The small, rough cabin has been added onto, now a proper farmhouse with glass windows. You have a few healthy milk cows, a flock of chickens, and a field that, in most years, produces a reliable crop of wheat. You are not wealthy, but you are secure. The gnawing hunger of those early years is now a memory, a story you tell to your children that they can't quite believe. Today is a special occasion. Your eldest son is returning home for a visit from the agricultural college back east that you, incredibly, have been able to help send him to. To celebrate, you decide to prepare a feast, a true feast, one that will honor the occasion and wash away the last lingering ghosts of the starving times. The preparations begin days in advance. You are no longer just a survivor in the kitchen. You are a planner, a creator. You consult a real, printed cookbook, one you ordered from the Sears, Roebuck & Co. Dear Lord, the recipes are full of ingredients that once seemed like exotic fantasies. For the main course, you will not have squirrel or prairie dog. You have selected a large, plump hen from your own flock. You will roast it, stuffed with a savory dressing made from stale bread, onions from your garden, and herbs you now grow in a small plot by the kitchen door. The smell of the roasting chicken fills the house, a rich, comforting aroma that speaks of abundance and domestic peace. There will be no boiled prairie turnips. Instead, you have a bounty of vegetables. You make mashed potatoes, whipped with fresh butter and cream from your own dairy pail until they are light and fluffy. There's a bowl of green beans, fresh from the garden, snapped and boiled just until tender, not cooked into a mush. You've made a dish of baked squash, sweetened with brown sugar and a sprinkle of cinnamon, a taste of autumn's sweetness. There will be no hardtack or weevil-laced biscuits. You have baked a loaf of soft, white bread, made from finely milled flour you bought at the general store. It is white, fairy, and fills the house with the intoxicating smell of yeast and progress. Alongside it, there is a small dish of bright yellow butter, churned this morning. There will be no gritty, eggshell coffee. You have a proper coffee grinder now, and you brew the coffee in a percolator, which produces a clear, strong, and mud-free cup. And for a final touch of elegance, there is a pitcher of cool milk on the table. This is where you allow yourself a small, private nod to the past. Tucked away amongst the feast is a small bowl of your famous Cockahari jet, made from the berries you still gather from the thicket by the creek. It's a reminder of where you came from, a link between the desperate forager you once were and the prosperous farmer you have become. This one small item holds more history than any book. The historical debate that frames this moment is about the closing of the frontier in 1890. The U.S. Census Bureau famously declared that the continuous frontier line, the boundary between settled and unsettled land, had ceased to exist. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner then proposed his famous frontier thesis, arguing that the process of taming the frontier was what had forged the unique American character, our individualism, our ingenuity, our ruggedness. Some historians today still see merit in this, arguing that the shared struggle of the frontier created a common culture, but many others critique it, pointing out that this narrative ignores the experiences of Native Americans, whose frontier was not open but closed, and of the many other diverse groups who don't fit the heroic pioneer mold. They argue that what was celebrated as the end of the struggle for settlers was the beginning of a new, and often more difficult, struggle for others. Your son arrives. He is taller, softer, and speaks with a different accent. He brings with him the world of science and theory. As you all sit down at the table, groaning under the weight of the food, a profound sense of gratitude washes over you. This is it. This is the dream you had, standing on that crowded street in the East so long ago. It is not the wild, romantic dream of a lone adventurer. It is this: a sturdy house, a loving family, and a table full of good food. You watch your son take a bite of the roast chicken, his eyes closing in pleasure. This is amazing. Muh, he says. They don't make it like this at school. You smile. You think back to the journey. You think of flour grout pancakes, of boiled leather, of the mysterious saloon stool and the rusty bacon. You think of all the terrible, desperate, and unpalatable things you ate to get to this moment. All of the compromises, the hardships, the near failures. They were the price of this meal. And as you look at the bounty on your table and the faces of your family, you know, with a certainty that fills your soul, that it was worth it, every last bite. And so, the journey through the unpalatable truths of the Old West comes to a gentle close. The clatter of the tin plate and the crackle of the campfire begin to fade, replaced by a softer, more distant hum. You can feel the story receding, like the tide going out on a quiet shore, leaving behind the smooth, worn pebbles of memory. The sharp pangs of hunger have softened into a comfortable, well-fed warmth. The vast, intimidating prairie sky, once a canvas for your fears, now becomes a gentle blanket of deep, dark blue, dotted with the faint, sleepy twinkle of distant stars. You are no longer standing in the dust of a new settlement, but resting in the comfort of your own bed. The feeling of the rough spun wool of a pioneer's shirt gives way to the familiar softness of your own sheets. The anxieties of survival, of finding the next meal, of facing the unknown, all dissolve into the quiet peace of the present moment. Your own journey is done for the day. You can let go of the pickaxe and the plow, the skillet and the rifle. There is nothing left to do but drift. Let the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing be the gentle, plodding pace of the oxen, carrying you now not across a harsh continent, but into the soft, welcoming landscape of your own dreams. The story is over. It is time to rest.